It was late September when I decided to take a short solo camping trip to clear my head. I'd just gone through a rough stretch, work stress piling up, an argument with my brother, and the feeling that I was running on autopilot for weeks. I needed space. Time alone in the woods always helped me reset. I didn't want to go anywhere too remote, just far enough to feel disconnected from everyday life. I picked a state forest in northern Pennsylvania, a place I hadn't been before but had read about online. It had primitive sites, no cell signal, and miles of trails weaving through thick woods, rocky ridges, and a few quiet streams. I packed my gear the night before: my old tent, a decent sleeping bag, plenty of food, a water filter, basic tools, a flashlight with extra batteries, a camp stove, a map, and a few backup items just in case. I'd been camping solo for years, so I felt confident in my routines. I left early in the morning to make the 3-hour drive north, arriving at the forest by early afternoon. The access road was gravel and wound deep into the trees. I passed maybe one other vehicle before I reached the parking area at the trailhead. I signed in at the small wooden station, hoisted my pack, and started hiking in. I chose a backcountry site that was about 2 miles in, near a bend in a creek, nestled between a stand of pine and a short slope rising to a rocky ridge. It wasn't an official site, just a flat clearing someone had clearly used before. There was a ring of blackened stones for a fire pit and logs set up like benches. It was quiet, peaceful, just the wind moving through the branches and the distant rush of the creek. I set up my tent, gathered dry wood, and filtered water from the stream. The rest of the afternoon I spent walking around the area, noting landmarks, deadfall clusters, mossy boulders, a thin deer trail nearby, so I could find my way back easily. I had no cell service, which I expected, but it still felt strange being that cut off. Even so, I liked it. That night, after a simple meal of rice and canned beans heated on my stove, I sat by the fire and listened to the forest. Distant owl calls, the sharp crack of branches far off, probably deer moving through. A few small animals rustled in the underbrush closer to camp, but nothing unusual. When the fire burned low, I climbed into my sleeping bag and lay there listening to the soft hum of insects and the occasional breeze brushing against the tent. I fell asleep quickly. At some point in the night, I woke up. It was still dark. I didn't know what time it was. Something had stirred me. My heart was beating faster than it should have been. I held my breath and listened. It wasn't a loud sound, more like the absence of the usual night noises. No crickets, no rustling, just stillness. Then I heard what I can only describe as footsteps, slow, deliberate on dry leaves, off to the right of the tent. Not close, but not far either. I stayed still. I didn't have a weapon, just a small camp knife, but I didn't reach for it. I didn't want to make any noise. The footsteps stopped. I waited. Nothing. After what felt like a long time, the normal forest sounds slowly returned. I must have laid there for another hour before sleep finally pulled me back under. In the morning, I got out of the tent and looked around the area. I didn't see anything out of place. No footprints, no broken branches. Just my own tracks from the day before. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, maybe a raccoon. I made breakfast, shook off the nerves, and decided to go on a long hike. I brought a day pack with essentials and left a marker near my camp just in case. I followed the trail along the creek, cutting deeper into the forest. The terrain got more rugged as I went. I passed a few old logging roads, now overgrown, and some decaying tree stands from hunters long gone. About 4 miles in, I reached a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. There was an old fire ring there too, and what looked like a collapsed wooden structure, maybe a hunting blind or makeshift shelter. I poked around a bit, then sat down for lunch. I didn't see or hear anyone else the entire time. That's when I noticed something weird. A crushed water bottle, not old, with a torn label. It didn't match any of the brands I had. Then I saw a ripped-up tarp half buried in leaves, and a section of paracord tied around a low branch. Nothing alarming by itself, but it didn't look like old debris. The items didn't have much weathering. Someone had been there recently, maybe even this season. I didn't want to linger. Something about the place felt wrong. I packed up and started back, taking a different route that looped around a ridge to avoid retracing my steps. That's when I got turned around. I noticed it when I passed the same strange stump twice, jagged like it had been split by lightning. I had my compass, so I adjusted and pushed west, which should have brought me back to the stream. But after an hour, I was still surrounded by unfamiliar trees and terrain that didn't match what I remembered. I wasn't panicking yet, but I was sweating more, moving faster, making mistakes. Eventually, I recognized the top of a ridge I had passed earlier in the morning and used that to reorient myself. When I finally reached camp, the sun was lower than I wanted it to be. My legs ached and my nerves were frayed, but I was relieved to see my tent still standing. I tossed down my pack and sat for a while. Then I noticed something subtle. My firewood pile had been disturbed. Not much, but the top pieces weren't where I'd left them. I tried to tell myself maybe a small animal had moved them, but they were stacked neatly, and the shift didn't look like random rooting around. It looked like someone had tried to move them quietly, carefully. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept the flashlight next to me, flicking it on every time I thought I heard something. The woods felt different, like they were holding their breath. I stayed zipped up, listening for footsteps, voices, anything. Once, just after midnight, I thought I saw a flicker of light through the trees, like a flashlight beam far off, but it disappeared before I could be sure. I told myself again that it could have been a trick of my eyes, maybe even distant headlights through the forest somehow. Still, I barely slept. The next morning, I packed everything quickly. I wanted out. The place didn't feel right anymore. I was breaking down the tent when I found something that made my stomach drop. Just under the edge of the rainfly, half buried in the dirt, was a cigarette butt. I don't smoke. I hadn't seen any sign of other campers nearby. It hadn't been there when I set up. I stared at it for a long time, then picked it up with a stick. The filter was slightly bent, dirt smudged on the paper, but otherwise fresh. No mold, no moisture. I finished packing and hiked out, moving fast. I kept checking behind me. Every snapping twig or bird call made me flinch. I didn't relax until I reached the parking area and saw my car sitting there, untouched. The only other vehicle was gone. I didn't wait around. I loaded up and drove out, gravel spitting behind my tires. I didn't tell anyone about it when I got home. It felt too strange, too uncertain. There wasn't a clear event, nothing dramatic, but I knew what I'd felt. I'd camped alone in dozens of places before. I knew the difference between regular forest sounds and something that wasn't normal. I kept replaying the night footsteps, the disturbed firewood, the cigarette. I even looked up reports from that area, missing hikers, strange encounters, anything. I found nothing solid. A couple of posts online about people feeling uneasy in that part of the forest, but no real incidents. Weeks passed. I tried to let it go. But one evening, I was organizing my gear in the garage, and I unrolled my tent to air it out. As I did, something small fell out of one of the folds. It was a scrap of lined paper, torn unevenly, with 2 words scrawled on it in blocky handwriting. Nice spot. That's when it all clicked into place for me. Someone had been near my camp. They'd watched me, moved around when I was gone, got close enough to plant something in my tent. The idea of someone being that close without me knowing made my skin crawl. They didn't take anything. They didn't hurt me, but they wanted me to know they'd been there, that they'd chosen not to, and they wanted me to think about that. I threw the paper in the fire pit behind my house and watched it burn until there was nothing left but ash. That was the last solo trip I took. I still go camping sometimes, but only with friends now, and never that deep in the woods. I don't care if I sound paranoid. I've seen how easy it is for someone to slip through the trees, unnoticed, watching, and I don't ever want to feel that again. It was early September, and the weather had just started to cool off. I had a few days off from work, and I wanted to spend them alone in the woods. I needed the silence, the space, the disconnection from everything. I packed up my gear, tent, sleeping bag, food, small stove, a map, my knife, flashlight, water filter, and a first aid kit, and drove out to the Colville National Forest in northeastern Washington. I'd read about a backcountry trail that wasn't too popular but still had a few nice, flat spots near the river where people sometimes camped. I left my car in a small gravel parking area near the edge of the forest. There were no other vehicles there. It made me feel better, knowing I'd probably be alone for most of the trip. I double-checked the gear on my back and started hiking just after 10 in the morning. The first part of the trail was gentle and wide. The sun came through the trees in patches, and the air had that cool, piney smell I always liked. I followed the trail for about 6 miles, deeper into the forest, until I reached a split in the path. There was a wooden sign, barely readable, pointing left toward Rock Falls and right toward River Bend. I went right. I wanted to set up camp near water. The trail got narrower and more overgrown. I had to duck under branches and step over fallen logs. Felt like no one had walked this part in a while. After another 2 miles, I reached a spot where the trees opened up a bit and the river came into view. The water was slow and clear, winding through rocks and roots. There was a small patch of flat ground not far from the bank, just big enough for a tent. I dropped my pack, stretched my back, and stood there for a while, listening to the water and looking around. It was peaceful, not a sound except the river and the wind in the trees. I set up my tent near a line of bushes, with the entrance facing the river. After getting everything in place, I gathered some dry wood and started a small fire. I heated up a can of beans and ate them with a plastic spoon, sitting on a flat rock. The sun dipped behind the trees and the air turned cold fast. I pulled on a jacket and sat by the fire until it burned down to embers. I turned in early, climbing into my sleeping bag with a flashlight and a paperback I barely read 2 pages of before my eyes started closing. Sometime in the night, I woke up. It was completely dark. The forest around me was silent, too silent. No insects, no owls, no wind. I wasn't sure what had woken me. I lay still for a few minutes, listening. I didn't hear anything, but my body felt tense. I didn't want to move, didn't want to make noise. It felt like something was just outside the tent. I stayed still for maybe half an hour until I slowly drifted off again, unsure whether I'd imagined the whole thing. The next morning, the sun came in through the thin nylon of the tent. I unzipped the door and looked out. Everything seemed normal. I walked to the river to splash water on my face and brush my teeth. Then I noticed something odd. My fire pit had been disturbed. The rocks were still there, but the ashes were scattered and the few remaining sticks were broken apart and spread around like someone had kicked at them. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or something, though it seemed too destructive for that. I looked around the campsite and checked my food stash, which I'd hung from a branch a good distance away. It was untouched. After breakfast, I decided to take a long walk up the river, just to explore. I followed the water upstream, hopping over rocks and ducking under low branches. About half a mile up, I saw something strange. A small circle of stones, arranged neatly, too neat to be natural. In the center was a pile of burnt wood, black and fresh. Someone had made a fire there recently. I looked around but didn't see any footprints or trash. I didn't hear anyone either. Felt like someone had been there but vanished. I turned back and made my way to camp. The whole way, I kept glancing over my shoulder. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. Back at camp, I sat for a while and debated whether I should leave. I had enough time and food for another night, and part of me didn't want to give in to paranoia. I decided to stay, but stay alert. I gathered more wood, made another fire, and kept my knife on me while I cooked. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing faint sounds, twigs snapping, a light rustling in the bushes, water splashing once, then silence again. Around midnight, I heard something that made my heart stop, a long, slow zip sound. My tent has only one zipper, and I hadn't touched it. I froze. My hand slid slowly toward the knife I kept near my sleeping bag. I waited, breathing as quietly as I could, ears straining for any sound. But after the zipper sound, there was nothing. No movement, no footsteps. I couldn't tell if I had imagined it. I lay there for hours, knife gripped tight, until the sky began to lighten and birds started calling again. When I stepped out of the tent, everything looked the same, almost. The zipper was halfway down. I always closed it completely. I stood there for a long time, looking around, trying to see signs of footprints. Anything. The ground was soft, covered in pine needles, and didn't show much. I packed up fast. I didn't even eat breakfast. I rolled up the tent, stuffed everything in my pack, and started back toward the trail. Every few minutes I stopped and listened. Once I thought I heard something behind me, like a soft thud on the path. But when I turned, nothing was there. It took longer to get back than I expected. I was tired, my pack felt heavier, and I kept getting this pressure in my chest like I needed to move faster. I made it to the trail split, then to the wide trail, and then finally saw the clearing where I'd parked my car. But something was wrong again. The back door was open. I hadn't left it like that. I approached slowly, heart racing. I looked inside. Everything was tossed around. My glove box was open, the papers scattered, and my emergency kit was missing. I checked the trunk. My spare gas can was gone too. I stood there trying to think. Who would do that? Why take a gas can and a first aid kit but leave everything else? I didn't see tire tracks or anything to show another car had been there. I just got in, locked the doors, and drove. I didn't stop until I hit a gas station 2 hours away. I sat there, parked by the pump, trying to piece everything together. It all felt connected: the quiet woods, the fire pit upstream, the tent zipper, the scattered fire pit, and now the break-in. Someone had been out there, watching, waiting. That night, back in my apartment, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the zipper moving or imagined someone standing outside the tent in the dark. I kept thinking about how silent the forest was that first night, how it didn't feel like an animal was nearby, but a person, someone careful, someone who knew how to move without making noise, someone who knew I was alone. Over the next few days, I kept checking local news. Nothing. No reports of missing hikers or break-ins. I thought about calling the ranger station, but what would I even say? That someone maybe opened my tent at night and messed with my fire pit? That someone maybe watched me for 2 days but never did anything? It sounded weak. It sounded like paranoia, but I know what I felt. I stopped going into the woods alone after that. I still hike sometimes, but only on busy trails and only during the day. I got rid of that tent. I changed the locks on my apartment even though I knew it was stupid. I started locking the bedroom door at night, too. I haven't told anyone the full story. Not like this. People think if nothing actually happened, then it's fine. But something did happen. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted or why they didn't do more. But they knew where I was, what I was doing, and how to get close without a sound. And that's what stays with me, because the scariest part wasn't what happened. It was what almost happened, what could have happened, and how easily I could have just disappeared out there, with no one ever knowing where I went or what I saw. And someone, whoever they were, was ready for that. They were ready for everything. I've been wanting to do a solo camping trip for a while. Something about being alone out in the woods, with no one around and nothing but the sound of nature, had always called to me. I think I just needed a break. Life had been getting noisy. I was tired of the same schedule, the phone ringing, emails piling up, and people expecting things from me every minute of the day. So I told everyone I was going off the grid for a few days. I packed up, filled my tank, and drove 6 hours north to a place I'd found online called Lake Cordwood. It wasn't a popular place, which I liked. It sat in the mountains, just a couple of miles off a dirt road that barely showed up on Google Maps. The few pictures I had seen made it look peaceful. Thick forest, a still lake, and trails that didn't seem well worn. It felt like the kind of place where I could go and not run into anyone. That's what I wanted. No people, no signals, just trees and water. I brought all the essentials. A tent, sleeping bag, a small cook stove, plenty of food, extra layers, a hatchet, a flashlight, a headlamp, a good knife, and my GPS just in case. I even packed bear spray and a whistle, even though there hadn't been any reports of bear activity up there. I left my car at a pull-off area that had room for 2 or 3 cars, but no one else was there. That reassured me that I'd have the place to myself. I locked the car, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started hiking up the trail. The trail was quiet and narrow, covered in pine needles. I could hear the wind moving through the trees and the occasional chirp from birds, but not much else. I didn't see any other signs of recent foot traffic, no footprints or broken branches, which made it feel even more secluded. It took me about an hour and a half to reach the lake. It was even more beautiful in person. A flat, mirror-like surface surrounded by dark green trees and a sloping ridge on the far side. The air smelled clean. I picked a spot about 30 yards from the lake, where the ground was mostly flat and soft enough to pitch a tent. I took my time setting everything up, making sure the tent was tight and dry, gathering sticks for a fire later, and filtering water from the lake. I kept checking around the woods just out of habit, listening for animals or anything that might be moving nearby, but everything stayed quiet. I made a small dinner, ate slowly, then sat by the lake until the sky turned dark. There was no moon, just stars and the reflection of them on the water. I could barely see my own breath when I exhaled. I crawled into my sleeping bag and tried to fall asleep to the sound of the wind. I woke up at some point deep in the night. I wasn't sure what time it was, but it was still pitch black. What woke me up was a sound. It was quiet, but it was enough to pull me out of sleep. I held still, listening. It sounded like a branch breaking, not a loud snap, but a slow, bending crack. It came from the woods on the side of the tent away from the lake. My heart picked up a little, but I told myself it was just a small animal. A deer, maybe. They were common in that area. Still, I lay there with my ears wide open, listening. Then I heard it again. Another quiet crack. And after that, what sounded like footsteps. Soft but heavy, moving slowly across the pine needles. I sat up in the tent and reached for my flashlight. I didn't want to shine it right away. I just held it and waited. The steps got closer. They weren't fast or loud, but they were definitely deliberate. Like someone was trying to be quiet but couldn't help making noise. I clicked the flashlight on and unzipped the tent just enough to look out. I didn't see anything. I panned the light around the woods, moving slowly. Trees, shrubs, the edge of the lake on the other side. Nothing moved. No eyes reflecting back at me. No shapes ducking behind a trunk. Just still woods. But I didn't feel calm. The kind of quiet I heard wasn't natural. I could feel it in my stomach. I zipped the tent closed again and sat for a while, just holding the flashlight. Eventually, I lay back down and tried to sleep again. I told myself it had to be a deer or maybe a raccoon. Something normal. The forest is full of sounds, especially at night. In the morning, I walked around the area. I looked for tracks or any kind of sign that something had been nearby. I found a few deer prints not far from the tent and what looked like some scuffed earth near a tree, like someone had kicked at the pine needles. I tried not to think too much of it. I made breakfast, walked around the lake, and even climbed a short ridge that gave me a nice view of the whole area. I didn't see anyone. No signs of a campfire, no tents in the distance. Just forest. That second night, I kept the fire going a little longer. The woods were darker than the night before. No stars. Clouds covered the sky, and it looked like it might rain. I crawled into the tent and lay there listening again. I don't think I really fell asleep that night, more like I drifted in and out. At some point, I heard a sound again. This time, it was different. Not a branch breaking, but a dull thud, like something heavy being dropped onto soft ground. I sat up quickly. Then I heard something that made my chest tighten. It was breathing, not loud or labored, but just a slow, steady breath. Not mine. Not close, but not far either. Like someone standing still just a few yards outside the tent. I didn't turn on the light this time. I just sat still, holding the zipper of the tent in my hand, barely moving. I don't know how long it lasted. Maybe a minute, maybe less. But the breathing stopped, and the woods were silent again. I didn't sleep at all after that. The next morning, I decided I'd cut the trip short. I didn't feel right about staying another night. I packed slowly, trying not to leave anything behind. When I stepped out to collect my food bag from the tree I had hung it on, I noticed something strange. The tree bark about 5 feet up had been scratched. Not clawed, but scraped in a straight line, like someone had taken a knife and dragged it across the surface. It wasn't deep, but it hadn't been there the day before. That was enough for me. I packed fast after that and started the hike back to my car. The trail was still quiet, still empty, but I didn't take my time. I just wanted to get back to the road and drive home. I made it back in a little over an hour. My car was right where I'd left it. No damage, no sign of anything strange. I loaded my pack, got in, and drove. I didn't stop until I hit the nearest gas station about 30 miles out. I used the bathroom, bought a coffee, and sat in the car for a few minutes just trying to slow my heart down. I told myself maybe it had just been an animal. Maybe someone else had been out there by chance and we both spooked each other. I didn't believe it, but it was the best explanation I could come up with. I didn't call the police. I didn't report anything. What would I even say? That I heard someone breathing near my tent? That I found a scratched tree? It wasn't a crime, just a bad feeling and some noises in the dark. I didn't go camping alone after that. I still go, but I bring a friend now, sometimes too. I never go back to Lake Cordwood. A few months later, I checked the forums where people talk about camping spots and remote trails. I saw a post from someone asking about the area around the lake. They said they went up there and felt like they were being watched the whole time. No one replied. A few weeks later, the post was gone. Sometimes, when I think about it, I wonder if maybe someone lives up there. Not officially, not with a house or mail or anything like that. Just someone who doesn't want to be found. Someone who watches when people come into their woods. Someone who doesn't make noise unless they want to. I think about the scratches on the tree, the breathing, the heavy steps, and I wonder how close they were, how long they stood there while I lay in my tent, pretending not to be scared, wondering what they were thinking. I still have that tent, but I keep it in the garage now. I don't like looking at it. Every time I do, I remember the sound of breathing in the dark. I remember holding the flashlight and not wanting to turn it on. I remember the feeling that something was out there, and that it was choosing not to be seen. That's the part that stays with me. It wasn't just something passing through. It was watching. It had time. It was patient. And it knew I was alone. I decided to take a solo camping trip at the end of September, when the weather was still decent during the day but cool enough at night to keep bugs away. I had a week off from work, and I needed some time to clear my head after a stressful few months. I picked a remote area in the northern part of Minnesota, near a series of lakes and old logging roads that barely showed up on GPS. The place wasn't completely off the grid, but it was far enough from towns and major roads that I figured I could go a couple days without seeing anyone if I timed it right. I packed carefully. My backpack had everything I needed for at least 5 days: tent, food, water filter, first aid kit, bear spray, a small hatchet, headlamp, backup flashlight, extra batteries, maps, compass, fire starter, emergency bivvy, even a small emergency radio with a hand crank. I wasn't new to this. I'd done plenty of camping and hiking, including solo trips. I knew what I was doing, and I wasn't planning anything reckless. I just wanted to hike in a few miles, find a good spot near one of the lakes, set up camp, fish a little, maybe take some photos, and enjoy the quiet. I drove up early on a Monday morning. The gravel road to the trailhead was rough, and my old truck didn't love it, but it got me there. There were no other vehicles parked when I arrived. I filled out a backcountry permit at the small ranger station, which was basically a wooden board with a weatherproof box attached. It was one of those self-registration setups. I wrote down the dates I'd be out and roughly where I was going. The area didn't have numbered sites. You were allowed to camp wherever you wanted as long as you followed leave no trace rules and stayed a safe distance from the water. The hike in was beautiful. The trees were just starting to turn, mostly gold with a few flashes of red. I passed a couple old fire rings and clearings but kept going until I found a spot I liked, maybe 4 or 5 miles in. It was tucked slightly uphill from a small lake, surrounded by pines and birches. I had a view of the water through the trees, and the ground was flat and dry. There were signs that someone had camped there before, but it had been a while. I set up my tent, cleared some dry leaves from the area, gathered firewood, and filtered some water from the lake. I didn't light a fire the first night. I just ate a cold meal, watched the sun go down, and crawled into my sleeping bag early. It was perfectly quiet, except for the wind in the trees and the occasional splash in the water. I slept well, better than I had in months. The next day, I hiked around the lake, took some photos, and found a few spots where I could fish. I caught a small northern pike and cooked it for dinner over a small fire. That night, it got colder, and I heard a few more sounds in the woods. Twigs snapping, rustling, but it was nothing unusual. The forest is full of animals. I've heard coyotes yipping before, raccoons fighting, even the heavy steps of deer moving around. It didn't bother me. On the third day, something started to feel off. I'd been out walking after breakfast, following a trail of animal tracks near a muddy patch by the water. I lost the trail when it went into the brush, but when I turned around to head back, I saw a broken branch hanging at an angle that I didn't remember. It looked fresh, like someone had just snapped it. I stopped and looked around, thinking maybe a deer had passed through, but there were no fresh tracks near it. No sound, just quiet, too quiet. No wind, no birds. I stood there for a minute trying to shake the weird feeling crawling up my spine. Back at camp, I noticed something else. My gear looked shifted, not stolen. Nothing was missing, but my sleeping bag was bunched up differently. My little cooking pot had been moved from where I'd left it near the fire ring. My water bottle was lying on its side. It was possible I'd just forgotten how I'd left things, but I'm a pretty organized person, especially when I'm alone in the woods. I always put things back the same way. I wrote it off as me being tired and distracted. Maybe a raccoon had poked around. I tried to ignore it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing something in the woods. Not constant, just now and then a crack, a shuffle. Always far enough away that I couldn't pinpoint it. I turned off my light and lay there, listening, trying to control my breathing. I didn't want to grab the flashlight unless I had to. I didn't want to give away my position if someone or something was out there watching. After a while, the sounds stopped. I eventually fell asleep, but it wasn't restful. The next morning, I decided to stay close to camp. I checked the perimeter, looked for tracks, anything unusual. I found a few scuffs in the dirt, maybe boot prints, but they weren't clear. Could have been mine from the day before. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling I wasn't alone out there. I ate a quick breakfast, packed a small day pack, and walked around the area slowly, trying to look calm even though I felt on edge. I kept my eyes moving, checking behind me now and then. Around noon, I returned and found a small stack of stones near my fire ring that I definitely hadn't made. 3 flat rocks carefully balanced. That wasn't wind or an animal. That was someone. I felt the blood drain from my face. I stood there staring at it for a long time, trying to figure out what to do. I didn't want to panic. I wasn't sure if it was a warning, a message, or just someone messing with me. But the fact that someone had been at my camp while I was gone made my skin crawl. I packed up my camp fast, keeping my head on a swivel. I didn't want to hike back out that late in the day, but staying didn't feel smart anymore. I got maybe a mile down the trail when I realized I was being followed. It wasn't obvious at first, just the sense that something was behind me. A branch would shift just after I passed it. A stone would roll downhill. I'd stop and wait, then hear nothing, then keep walking, only for it to start again. I tried doubling back once, taking a sharp turn off the trail and looping around, but I didn't see anyone. Still, the feeling never left me. I pushed hard and got back to the trailhead around sunset. My truck was just where I left it, no signs of tampering. I got in and locked the doors immediately, heart pounding. I sat there for a while, just breathing, trying to calm down. Then I drove out, checking my rearview mirror every few seconds. I didn't stop until I was 2 hours away, parked at a gas station in a well-lit area. When I got home, I dumped all my gear out and checked everything. Nothing missing. No notes. No signs that anything had been damaged. Just little things. Tiny, subtle changes. A zipper halfway down. My sleeping mat rolled tighter than I remembered. It messed with my head more than I expected. I thought maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was just stressed. But a week later, I got a call from the park office. They said another camper had reported something strange in the same area. A solo hiker had come across a makeshift shelter deep in the woods, branches tied together with rope, old gear inside, and a bunch of stripped animal bones hanging from trees. They thought maybe someone had been living out there. When rangers checked it out, it was empty. looked recently abandoned, but they found cigarette butts, scraps of food, even a worn-down boot. The area was officially marked off-limits after that. I haven't gone back. I still camp, but never alone, and never that far out anymore. That trip stuck with me. The worst part is not knowing exactly who was out there. It wasn't a bear or a ghost or some wild hallucination. It was a person, a real person who got close enough to touch my things, who left no trace of themselves except for what they wanted me to see. Someone who watched me without making a sound. Someone who waited until I was gone, or maybe even watched while I slept. It wasn't the woods that scared me. It was knowing that someone had decided not to be seen. Someone who knew how to move quietly. Someone who didn't want me there. And the more I think about it, the more I realize I left just in time. If I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have made it out. I had been planning the trip for months. The stress at work had piled up so high that I could feel it in my shoulders every time I took a breath. I needed something away from people, noise, and screens. So, I took a week off and decided to go camping by myself. I chose a spot in northern Utah, in a less popular part of the Uinta Mountains. There was a remote area about 5 miles off the main trail, near a small, unnamed lake. I'd found it by scanning satellite maps, cross-referencing topographic layers, and reading old backpacking forums. There wasn't much info on it, which made it perfect. I packed everything carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, bear canister, water filter, small axe, fixed blade knife, camp stove, fuel, extra lighters, food for a week, and a solar charger for my phone. I wasn't planning to use the phone much, but I kept it charged for GPS and emergencies. I also brought a small first aid kit, a satellite beacon, and enough layers to handle unexpected weather. I went over the gear checklist again and again, not wanting to forget anything. I left early on a Monday morning and drove 5 hours to a gravel turnout at the end of an old forest road. There were no other cars. I parked the truck, made sure all the windows were shut, locked it, threw on my pack, and started the hike in. The trail was quiet, barely more than a game trail in some parts. It twisted through a thick pine forest, up rocky inclines, down into shallow ravines. The deeper I went, the quieter everything got. No planes overhead, no distant road hum. Just wind in the trees and the occasional call of a bird. It took me most of the day to reach the lake. When I got there, I wasn't disappointed. It was small, ringed with trees and thick brush, with a little crescent of sandy shoreline on the north side. The water was clear enough to see stones on the bottom several feet out. I dropped my pack, stretched my back, and looked around. There were no signs anyone had camped there in years. No fire rings, no trash, no boot prints. Just deer tracks and pine needles. I picked a flat spot about 20 yards from the shore and set up the tent. Then I collected wood for a small fire. I didn't plan on cooking over it, just wanted the warmth and light. I cleared a circle, made a fire pit with stones, and gathered dry branches from fallen trees nearby. By the time I got it all together, the sun had dropped behind the trees and the lake was shaded. The wind was cool. I lit the fire, boiled some water on the stove, and had a freeze-dried meal while watching the flames. It was quiet, peaceful. For the first time in months, I felt calm. I went to bed early. The night was cold but not unbearable. I had a good sleeping bag and thermals. I lay there listening to the occasional crack of wood-settling or distant owl calls. At one point, I heard something move outside the tent, just a light rustling, probably a rabbit or a raccoon. I wasn't worried. I had food in the bear canister locked and set far from the tent. Everything else was packed up. I eventually fell asleep. The next day, I spent time hiking around the area. I didn't go far, maybe a mile or two in different directions. I found some small game trails, a bunch of deer scat, and what looked like an old rusted hunting stand in a tree, maybe a quarter-mile east of the lake. It looked like it hadn't been used in a decade. I explored for a while, then came back and filtered water from the lake. I spent the afternoon fishing with a collapsible rod I brought, caught a couple small trout, and cooked one over the fire. The air was crisp. I didn't see or hear a single person. That second night, something woke me up. I wasn't sure what it was. I didn't hear anything specific, just jolted awake like my body knew something was off. I sat up and listened. There was nothing, just the wind moving gently through the trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I unzipped the tent, stuck my head out, and looked around. The fire was out, the stars were bright, and everything looked normal. But it felt different, like something had changed in the environment in a way I couldn't name. I stepped out quietly, put on my boots, and walked around the campsite with my flashlight. Everything was where it should be. Bare canister untouched, fishing gear in its place, tent undisturbed. But near the edge of the woods, I noticed something odd. A line of small sticks had been arranged on the ground in a half circle. I hadn't put them there. They hadn't been there before. I froze. My first thought was animal activity, maybe a curious raccoon or squirrel. But the placement was too neat, too deliberate, like someone had laid them down. I slowly scanned the trees with the flashlight but didn't see anything. Still, I couldn't shake the unease crawling up my back. I picked up the sticks and tossed them randomly into the brush. Then I walked a wider loop around the camp, scanning everything. Nothing else seemed disturbed. No footprints, no sounds, no lights in the distance. Eventually, I went back into the tent, zipped it shut, and laid there awake for hours. The next day, I tried to brush it off, told myself it could have been natural. Wind, falling branches, and animals' nesting behavior. I wanted to enjoy the trip and not spiral. I forced myself to eat, hiked a bit more, and wrote a few things in a small notebook I kept. I didn't see anything else strange that day, but I didn't feel relaxed anymore. I kept checking over my shoulder. Every branch crack made me tense up. I started keeping my knife on me all the time. On the fourth morning, I woke up and noticed something missing. The small folding chair I'd been using was gone. I checked all around the site. It wasn't where I'd left it. It wasn't tipped over. It was just gone. I walked a wide circle around the area, looking through the brush, up into the trees. Nothing. It was like it had vanished. That's when I knew someone had to be out there. Animals don't take chairs. I stood in the middle of the camp, turning slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. No sound. I packed up my gear that morning. Not all of it, just the essentials. I planned to hike back to the truck. I'd only been there 3 nights. I still had food left, but something was off and I didn't want to find out what it was. The walk back would take a good part of the day. When I got to the spot where the trail met the edge of the lake, I saw the boot prints. 2 sets. One was clearly mine from the day I arrived. The other was newer, going in the same direction I had come from. Slightly larger size, deeper impressions. Someone had walked in after me. The prints stopped at my camp, then turned around and went back toward the forest. I followed them a little ways. They disappeared in a patch of rocky ground about 50 yards in. I stood there for a long time, breathing slowly, listening. I went back to grab the rest of my gear. As I approached the tent, I noticed something sticking out from one of the trees. Piece of white fabric. When I got closer, I saw it was a strip of my thermal shirt, the one I'd washed and hung to dry a day earlier. It had been tied around a branch. There was a small smear of something brownish red on it. I didn't touch it. I backed away slowly, packed up everything fast, and started moving. I hiked hard, only stopping a couple times to drink water. The trail felt different on the way back. I kept checking behind me, thinking I heard something. Once I swore I saw movement to the left of the trail, but when I turned to look, there was nothing but brush and trees. When I finally reached the gravel turnout and saw my truck, I nearly cried, but something stopped me in my tracks. The passenger door was open. I know I locked it. I remember checking all the doors before I left. I walked up slowly, holding my knife. The cab had been rifled through. Glove box open, papers everywhere. The contents of the emergency kit were scattered across the floor. Nothing was stolen, just messed with. I started the truck, turned over fine. I drove away as fast as I could, not stopping until I was back on the main road. I drove for another hour before I pulled over at a gas station, locked the doors, and sat there just breathing. I stayed at a cheap motel that night. I kept waking up every hour, checking the windows, listening. When I got home, I went through all my gear carefully. Everything was there except the chair and the fabric strip. I checked the GPS data on my phone. No anomalies, no photos, nothing to give me answers. I didn't tell anyone about it for a while. It sounded crazy. I wasn't attacked. Nothing was taken. But someone had been out there, watching, following, messing with my things. And I still don't know why. Eventually, I reported it to the Forest Service, just to have it on record. They didn't find anything. No known squatters in that area. No other reports. Just me. That trip cured me of my love for remote solo camping. I still hike. I still camp sometimes. But not alone. And not that far out. Because the scariest thing out in the wild isn't the bears or the weather or getting lost. It's the people who hide out there, away from the world, doing God knows what, and the fact that you'll probably never know they were even there until it's too late. I'd been planning the trip for a while, probably a few months. I wanted something quiet, far from everything, somewhere I could clear my head. Life in the city had gotten too loud. Cars, people, construction, just too much noise. I was getting headaches almost every day and wasn't sleeping well. So I looked up remote places to camp in northern Idaho, where it gets real quiet. I found this small area near a lake that didn't show up much on the maps. No nearby towns, just a dirt road that led about 7 miles off the highway into forest. The satellite view showed thick trees, no signs of cabins or houses, just green. That's what I wanted. Peace, nature, solitude. I packed up everything I thought I might need. A new tent, sleeping bag, freeze-dried food packs, water filter, knife, rope, flashlight, a solar charger, and a couple backup power banks. I also brought my old revolver. I didn't plan on using it, but it gave me peace of mind, being out there alone. I kept it locked in a hard case in my pack with a small box of rounds. I figured worst case, it'd scare off an animal if I needed it. I didn't tell anyone the exact location I was going to, just a general area to a coworker who probably wouldn't even remember. I left early on a Wednesday morning. I wanted to arrive and set up before dark. It was early May, the days were just getting longer, and the weather had started warming up. Still chilly at night, but nice during the day. The drive out there was long and uneventful. After I got off the highway and onto the Forest Service road, things started to feel different. Quiet. I lowered the windows and all I could hear was the wind and the gravel under my tires. I passed one other truck coming the other way, but that was it. After about 6.5 miles, the road got rougher. Ruts, some shallow mud patches, fallen branches. My SUV handled it okay, but I had to slow way down. I finally reached a small clearing just before the road ended at a steep embankment. Beyond that was nothing but woods. I parked, stretched my legs, and got out to look around. The clearing was about 20 feet across, enough space to pitch the tent and start a fire. There was a narrow path leading down a slope toward the lake I'd seen on the map, but I couldn't see the water from where I was. I set up camp quickly, got the tent up, laid out my sleeping bag and gear, then took the flashlight and walked down the path to the lake before it got dark. The lake was beautiful, perfectly still, not a ripple. It was surrounded on all sides by trees and large rocks near the shoreline. No trash, no signs of anyone ever being there recently. I sat for a while on a flat rock near the edge, watching the water reflect the sky. No sounds except a few birds, some frogs. It was exactly what I'd needed. The first night went fine. It got cold, but I was prepared. The sleeping bag was good, and I had layers on. I woke up once to what sounded like something walking through the brush outside the tent, but it didn't come close. Probably a deer or a raccoon. I stayed still and eventually fell back asleep. The next day, I explored around the area. I followed the lake's edge for maybe a mile and found a small stream feeding into it. The water was clear and cold, perfect for filtering. I refilled my bottles and made note of where it was. On the way back, I found what looked like a very old hunting blind, just a crude wooden structure half collapsed and overgrown. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. I left it alone. That afternoon, I heard something strange. It was just before sundown. I was sitting near the fire, boiling water for dinner. From deeper in the woods behind my tent, I heard what sounded like a tree falling. Not just a branch, a full tree. There was a cracking noise, then a heavy thud that shook the ground a little. I stood up and looked, but I couldn't see anything through the trees. Then it was quiet again. No birds, no wind, just dead stillness. I didn't sleep as well that night. I kept thinking about the tree. Could have just fallen naturally. They do that. But something about the timing bothered me. It had been calm all day, no strong wind. It wasn't even raining. I left the flashlight and my knife within arm's reach just in case. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke up when the sun came through the tent wall. The third day, things started to feel different. I couldn't explain it, but something had shifted. The woods didn't feel as calm. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. Felt like it was waiting for something. I chalked it up to being alone and not talking to anyone for a few days. I spent the morning walking the opposite direction along the lake, where the trees grew thicker. The forest floor was soft with old leaves and moss, and it was hard to tell how far I'd gone. After a while, I noticed something strange. There were boot prints in the mud near the shore. Not mine. These were deeper, wider. I hadn't seen anyone. They weren't fresh, but not too old either. Maybe a few days. They led back into the trees, away from the lake. I didn't follow them. I stood there for a while, looking in the direction they went, trying to decide if I should check it out. But something in my gut told me not to. I backed away, walked the long way around, and returned to camp without going further into that area. That night, I woke up again to movement outside the tent. This time it was different. The steps were slower, more deliberate. I held my breath and listened. Whatever it was, it moved around the tent once. Then it stopped. I could hear it breathing, not loud but steady. I reached slowly for the flashlight and clicked it on. The moment the beam lit up the tent walls, the sound stopped. No more breathing, no steps, just silence. I waited a long time before turning it off again. I didn't hear anything else the rest of the night, but I barely slept. In the morning, I looked for tracks. I found some flattened grass, a few partial prints in the soft dirt, too large to be mine. The heels sunk deeper, like someone had been standing there for a while. I walked the perimeter of the camp and found more signs. Twigs snapped at shoulder height, small scuff marks. Someone had been watching me. I was sure of it now. I spent most of the day packing. I wasn't ready to leave, but something wasn't right. I didn't feel safe anymore. Around noon, I started hearing movement in the woods again, but I couldn't see anything, just rustling. I yelled out once, hoping it was another camper, someone who'd gotten turned around. No response. I made the decision to leave the next morning. I didn't want to drive out at night on that narrow road. That night, I stayed inside the tent. I kept the flashlight in one hand and the revolver nearby. I didn't cook dinner, didn't want to start a fire and draw attention. Around midnight, I heard the noises again. This time, more than one set of steps. They moved quietly, but I could tell there were at least two different rhythms. One faster, one slower. I held my breath, heart pounding. I heard someone brush against the tent wall. Then silence again. I didn't sleep. At first light, I unzipped the tent slowly and looked out. Nothing. I packed everything as fast as I could, not caring how neatly it went. When I went to grab the water bottles I'd left by the fire pit, I noticed one was missing. The other had been emptied and placed back upright, like someone had poured it out and set it down on purpose. I got in the car and started down the dirt road. Every turn, every dip, I expected to see someone step out of the trees, but I never did. I reached the highway and drove nonstop until I hit the nearest town with a gas station. I pulled over, locked the doors, and just sat for a while, trying to calm down. I didn't report anything. What would I even say? Someone might have been following me? There were no real signs of a crime. No proof. Just tracks, missing water, a few noises in the dark. Maybe I'd imagined parts of it. Maybe. A few weeks later, I was scrolling through local news online and saw a short article. A man had gone missing in that same area. Name wasn't familiar. He'd gone out hiking and never came back. They found his car, but no sign of him. The article mentioned that area was popular with off-grid squatters and people hiding from the law. That stuck with me. I didn't go camping for a long time after that. I still think about those prints and the water bottle, the slow breathing outside the tent. Whatever was out there wasn't an animal. It wasn't the woods playing tricks on me. Someone was watching me, maybe more than one. Maybe they were deciding whether to do something worse. Maybe they were waiting for the right night. But for whatever reason, they didn't. They let me leave. My name is Evan Reed. I was 31 when this happened, summer of 2017. I lived in Spokane, Washington at the time, and I worked in maintenance for a community college. Not the worst job. Paid okay, quiet work. I'd just gotten out of a long relationship back then. For years with a woman I thought I'd marry. But things fell apart slowly, then all at once. You know how it goes. I needed time to clear my head, so I figured I'd do a solo trip. I'd camped plenty as a kid, and I'd done some solo trips before, though none more than a weekend. This time, I wanted something longer. Just me and silence. I rented a small, off-grid cabin for 2 weeks up in northeastern Washington, near Colville National Forest. The cabin sat way back in the woods, about 5 miles from the nearest dirt road. You had to park your car at a clearing, then hike in with your gear. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, a rain barrel, and a composting toilet out back. The cabin was owned by some older guy named Murray, retired forestry worker. He built the place himself back in the 80s. I found it listed on some backwoods rental site. The pictures made it look perfect. Just a simple wooden structure with thick forest all around and a small creek nearby. I got there on a Wednesday afternoon in late July. It had been a dry summer, so the trail leading to the cabin was dusty and cracked. It took me nearly 2 hours to haul all my stuff in. 2 trips with my gear, cooler, tools, food, and a small solar charger I brought for my phone, though I knew there was no signal out there. When I finally stepped into the cabin, the heat hit me right away. It was stifling inside, and the windows had all been shut for who knows how long. Dust floated in the light beams cutting through the small front window. I opened every window and propped the door for airflow. The place was simple, just a twin bed, a table, a shelf with some old paperbacks, a few pots and pans, and a little wood stove in the corner. There was a logbook on the table with names and short entries going back 20 years. I flipped through a few. Most people had only stayed a couple nights. A few had left little hand-drawn maps of good hiking trails nearby. One guy had scribbled a whole page about watching a bobcat down by the creek. After settling in, I spent that first evening just unwinding. I cooked some pasta on my camp stove outside and sat on a log watching the sky turn orange. I remember the quiet, that kind of quiet you only get way out in the woods, where there's no hum of cars or appliances, just the occasional bird call, the wind through the trees, and your own breathing. The first night passed without anything strange. I slept hard, too hard actually. Woke up drenched in sweat around 2 a.m. because I forgot how warm those old sleeping bags get in summer. I got up, splashed water from the rain barrel on my face, then went back to bed. Took me a while to fall asleep again. Every little rustle outside the cabin set my ears up. A branch snapping, leaves crunching, normal wood stuff, but when you're alone, even a raccoon sounds like a person. The second day, I hiked around and found that creek maybe half a mile south of the cabin. The water was low but cold and clean. I filled up a few bottles and ran them through the filter I brought. I spotted deer tracks in the mud. Some small ones too, maybe a fawn. I also found what looked like a hunting blind up in a tree about 20 minutes from the cabin. It was old, falling apart, but it had good sight lines over a wide slope. I climbed up just to see, and when I looked back the way I'd come, I realized how easy it was to get turned around. Everything looked the same, green and brown and still. That evening, I built a small fire in the pit outside and cooked sausages. Sat by the fire until it was just glowing coals. I watched the trees sway under the moonlight and felt that calm again. I remember thinking I could really spend a lot more time out there. Maybe I'd come back in the fall when it was cooler. The weird stuff didn't start until the third night. I woke up around 1:30 a.m. to a noise outside. Something fast and light, like feet moving across the leaves. Not a thud, more like a patter. I sat up, heart already going. I listened hard, holding my breath. There it was again. A quick rustle, then nothing. Now, I'm not the paranoid type, but I'm not stupid either. I knew animals came around cabins, raccoons, maybe even a bear if you left food out. But I'd been careful. Food was stored in a cooler, locked and weighted. Trash tied up and hung in a tree away from the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it out the window. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I opened the door slowly and stepped outside barefoot, flashlight in hand. I swept it around. Still nothing. Then I noticed something odd. The firewood I'd stacked on the side of the cabin had been moved. Not all of it, just enough that it looked wrong. 2 or 3 pieces had been taken from the middle of the stack and placed on the ground, a few feet away, like someone had pulled them out and then dropped them there. That's not something an animal would do. I knelt down and looked at the dirt. I thought I saw a print. Maybe a shoe, maybe just where the wood had fallen. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat inside with the flashlight on and my multi-tool in hand, listening. By morning, I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe I'd stacked the wood wrong and it fell. Maybe a deer kicked it. Still, I felt weird. I did a big loop hike that day to clear my head. Took about 4 hours through some rocky ridges to the north and back through thicker pine forest. Found some elk droppings and a weird metal box half buried in the dirt. Just an old toolbox, rusted shut. Probably a hunter left it there years ago. That night, I didn't light a fire. I sat inside and read an old paperback someone had left behind. Some western from the 70s. Around midnight, I turned in, but I didn't sleep well. At 3:12 a.m., I remember because I checked my watch, I heard tapping. Not knocking, tapping. On the side of the cabin. Soft, like someone drumming fingers on the wood. I froze. The sound moved. Tap, tap. Then a few seconds of silence. Then again on the back wall. Then the side window. I didn't move. I just listened, every muscle locked. Then nothing. No footsteps. No crunching leaves. Just silence. I stayed like that for an hour until the sun started to rise. That morning I checked around the cabin. No tracks. No marks. But again, something small was off. My pack, the one I'd left just inside the door, was now sitting just outside, propped up against the cabin wall. I didn't move it. No animal would have dragged it like that and not torn into it. I started thinking about heading out early. I had about 8 days left in the rental, but I started making plans. I wasn't scared exactly, just uneasy, like someone was watching the place. I hiked out to where the trail meets the clearing where my car was. I didn't see anyone, no other cars, but I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A pile of stones had been stacked next to the trail. Perfect little stack about knee-high, like a cairn but recent. Moss hadn't grown on them yet, and I didn't remember it being there when I came in. I picked one of the stones up. Underneath, I saw something dark, a scrap of fabric, navy blue. I pulled it out and found it was a piece of synthetic jacket, like from a windbreaker, torn. I didn't know what to make of it, but it put me on edge. That night I didn't cook, just ate a protein bar and stayed inside. Kept my light off, just sat by the window looking out into the woods. I thought I saw movement a few times, shadows between trees. Could have been animals, could have been nothing. I didn't sleep. At dawn, I packed everything. I made 2 fast trips to the car, heart pounding every time I left the cabin. I didn't hear or see anything, but the woods felt charged, like the air before a storm. When I got back to the car on my second trip, I found something that made my knees go weak. On the hood of my Subaru was a handprint. Not a smudge, not dirt, a full, clear print made in ash, like someone with dirty hands had pressed their palm flat on the metal. It wasn't there an hour earlier. I loaded up the last of my stuff and drove out without looking back. I reported it to the county sheriff's office when I got back to town. They said they'd send someone to check it out. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. I never heard back. 2 weeks later, I got a text from the rental site. The listing for the cabin had been removed. No explanation, just gone. I still think about it sometimes. Not every day, but enough. Someone was out there. Not some crazy killer or forest spirit. Just a person. Watching. Testing. Waiting maybe. And I think if I'd stayed one more night, I might have found out why. Or I wouldn't be telling this story at all. I was 34 when I decided to leave everything behind for a while. I had spent the past 8 years working in advertising in New York City, staring at glowing screens, pitching nonsense to companies I didn't care about. After a particularly brutal month of 14-hour days and sleepless nights, I finally broke. I took unpaid leave and left the city. My plan was simple: disappear for a month and write the book I'd been talking about for years. I found a cabin on a small rental site. It wasn't on Airbnb or any fancy platform, just an old listing with a couple blurry photos and a vague description. Quiet retreat in the Vermont woods. No internet, no cell service, solar power, well water, with stove. 7 miles from town. That was all it said. It was perfect. I packed my car with groceries, my laptop, notebooks, and clothes. I even brought some basic tools and my old hunting knife my grandfather gave me when I was a kid. The cabin was near a small town called Weston, Vermont. I'd never heard of it, but that didn't matter. I wanted to be away from everything. The last few miles of the drive were on a dirt road so narrow that branches scraped against my car on both sides. I kept thinking I'd missed a turn, but eventually the trees opened up just enough to reveal a small clearing. And there it was, the cabin. It was smaller than I'd expected. One main room with a bed, a small table, and a wood stove. There was a little kitchenette with a gas-powered stove and a small fridge that ran on solar. The bathroom was more like an outhouse attached to the side, but at least it had a composting toilet and a gravity-fed shower. The water came from a tank I had to fill manually from a pump near the woodshed. I was excited. I was finally away from everything. The silence was overwhelming the first night. No sirens, no cars, not even planes overhead. Just the wind through the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. The first few days went exactly as I'd hoped. I woke up early, made coffee on the stove, and wrote until it got dark. I cooked simple meals, read in the evenings by lantern, and went to bed early. There was no signal for my phone, no internet to distract me. I was finally doing what I said I'd do for years, but around the 5th night, something changed. I was sitting at the little table, writing by lantern light, when I heard something outside. It was faint at first, just a rustle. I assumed it was an animal. There were squirrels all over, and I'd seen a couple deer near the edge of the clearing that morning. But then it happened again, closer this time. A definite, deliberate sound, like a footstep. I froze. I turned off the lantern and waited, listening. My ears adjusted to the silence. I couldn't hear anything for a minute. Then another step, and another. Something was walking around the cabin. I stood quietly and moved toward the window. I couldn't see anything at first. The moon was behind the clouds, and the forest was almost pitch black. But then, near the tree line, I saw a shape, a human shape. Someone was standing there, not moving, just watching. I blinked, looked again. The shape was gone. I stayed up the rest of the night with the lights off. I held my knife and kept glancing out the window every 10 minutes. But I didn't see anything else. In the morning, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe I was just jumpy. I hadn't spoken to another person in almost a week, and maybe that was messing with my head. I went outside and walked the perimeter of the cabin. I found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing unusual. But that night, it happened again. This time, it started with a scraping sound, like something dragging across the wall of the cabin. I turned off the lantern and waited. It was just past 10 p.m. I hadn't gone to bed yet. The scraping stopped, and I heard the crunch of leaves. Slow, deliberate steps. They circled the cabin. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stood there in the dark, holding the knife. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. In the morning, I went outside again and checked the walls. There were faint scratches on the wood, about waist-high. Nothing deep, nothing clear, but they hadn't been there before. I started locking the cabin more carefully after that. I kept the knife with me at all times, even inside, and I started sleeping with one ear open, waking at every sound. I thought about leaving, but I was 7 miles from the nearest town, and the road was rough. My car was fine, but I didn't want to run at the first weird noise. I wanted to believe I could stick it out, that this was just paranoia. A few more nights passed without anything. I thought maybe whoever or whatever it was had moved on. But then, I woke up one night to the sound of the door handle turning. I hadn't imagined it. I heard the metal click. Then again, someone was trying to open the door, slowly, like they didn't want to make noise. I sat up and grabbed my knife. The door was locked, but it wasn't a strong lock, just a single bolt. I waited. The handle stopped moving. Then came the footsteps, slow around the cabin again. Same pattern. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I packed a small bag and walked toward town. I figured I'd call the property owner, maybe get a police check. But a mile down the trail, my phone still had no signal, and the path was covered in fallen branches. It would take hours to get to town on foot, so I went back. I told myself I'd give it one more night. I slept during the day so I could stay awake all night. I turned off all the lights and sat in the corner with a blanket wrapped around me, watching the windows. It was around 1 a.m. when I saw the shape again. This time, it wasn't at the tree line. It was right outside the window, just a silhouette. A man, definitely, standing perfectly still, not doing anything, just watching. I didn't move. I didn't blink. After maybe 5 minutes, he stepped backward and vanished into the dark. That was the last straw. At first light, I packed everything into the car and drove straight to town. It was a tiny place. Weston barely had a gas station. I found the police station, which was really just a small building with a single cruiser out front. I told the officer everything. He listened, nodded, and made a call. Another officer drove back with me to the cabin. We walked the perimeter again. Nothing obvious. No footprints, no signs of a break-in. Then he found something. Behind the cabin, near the woodshed, there was a narrow path I hadn't noticed. It led deeper into the trees. About 50 yards in, we found a small clearing. There were wrappers on the ground, a couple beer cans, and what looked like an old tarp. Someone had been camping there, watching. The officer radioed it in. He said it might have been a squatter, maybe someone living off-grid, or maybe just someone messing with me. Either way, he said I made the right call. I didn't stay. I left that day and never went back. A few weeks later, I got a call. They'd found more signs in the woods, makeshift traps, old food cans, even a journal with strange notes in it. Nothing criminal, just odd. No name, no ID. Whoever it was had vanished. I didn't finish the book. I haven't gone back to the woods since. But sometimes, when I lie in bed at night, I think about that shape standing in the dark, just watching. I think about how quiet the forest was, how easy it would have been for someone to live out there, unnoticed, and how lucky I was to leave when I did. My name's Mason. Back in 2017, I was 28 years old and stuck in a rut I didn't see coming. I just quit my job in Boston, some marketing gig that paid well but had me staring at screens for 12 hours a day. My girlfriend had left a few months earlier, said I was distant, said I was becoming someone she didn't recognize. She was right. That fall, I started to spiral. I drank more, slept during the day, ignored friends, ignored bills. When winter hit, I realized I needed to get out of the city, somewhere cold and quiet. Just me, no distractions. I found a place on an old forum. Somebody was renting out a remote cabin in northern Vermont for cheap. Guy said it had wood heat, a basic kitchen, no Wi-Fi, no cell reception. Sounded perfect. The drive took most of the day. Snow had started falling just north of Montpelier, and by the time I hit the turnoff near a town called Craftsbury, visibility was getting bad. The GPS on my old Subaru gave out 10 miles past the last gas station. I followed the directions I'd printed off, winding through back roads lined with leafless trees and snow-covered stone walls. Every few miles I passed an old barn or a rundown farmhouse, but mostly it was just woods. dark, wet woods that closed in on both sides like a tunnel. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow dirt road that curved downhill through a birch grove. It looked smaller than I'd expected, single-story, weathered cedar planks, a rusted metal chimney poking out from the roof. There was a small woodshed to the side and a frozen creek just down the slope. The place had a tilted porch with one broken step and a screen door hanging by one hinge. Inside, it was dark and cold. The front room was one big open space with a fireplace, a tiny kitchen tucked into the corner, a table with 2 chairs, and an old couch that looked like it had seen better decades. A hallway led to a single bedroom and a tiny bathroom. The air smelled like mildew and wood smoke. A few spider webs hung in the corners. I lit a fire first thing. Took forever to get going. The logs in the shed were damp and half-rotted, but after enough newspaper and frustration, the flames finally caught. I unpacked my gear, just a duffel bag with clothes, a box of canned food, a few bottles of water, and a flask I'd filled with bourbon for emergencies. I set up my laptop even though there was no Wi-Fi, just to journal or watch movies I'd downloaded. But mostly I planned to read, right? Maybe go hiking once the weather cleared. The first night was peaceful. I remember that. The fire popped quietly, and snow tapped at the windows like tiny fingers. It was the kind of quiet that made you realize how loud cities were. No cars, no people yelling, just wind and trees. I slept well under a pile of old quilts I found in the bedroom closet. But the peace didn't last. It started the second night. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise. Not a crash or bang, just this slow, rhythmic creaking, like someone walking in circles on the porch. I sat up, heart thudding, and held my breath. Kept going, a step every few seconds. Would groaning under weight. It stopped after a minute. I figured maybe it was a deer, or the wind shifting the porch boards. Still, I couldn't sleep after that. The next morning, I saw footprints in the snow outside the front door. Human ones, boot prints. They circled the cabin once and disappeared back into the woods. They weren't mine. I'd stayed inside all day. They were spaced far apart, like the person was tall or walking fast. I told myself it was probably a local hunter. Maybe someone checking out the place, thinking it was empty. The guy I rented from hadn't mentioned neighbors, but I hadn't asked either. Still, the sight of those tracks, fresh and clear, made the skin on my neck prickle. I spent the day chopping some of the dryer wood I found at the bottom of the stack. I tried to distract myself with reading, cooking, and writing nonsense in my journal. But every sound outside made me twitch. The wind in the trees, branches falling, snow shifting on the roof. I didn't sleep that night either. The third night, something woke me again. This time it was a scrape, like metal on wood. Came from the back of the cabin, near the kitchen. I sat up on the couch, where I'd been dozing with the fire dying out. The sound came again. Scrape, pause, scrape. I crept into the kitchen and looked out the back window. Nothing but darkness and trees. In the morning, I found more tracks. This time, they led from the creek up to the back of the house. Someone had walked right up to the rear wall and just stood there. No boot prints leading away, just a set of them straight to the wall and nothing else. I tried to convince myself they'd been covered by snowfall, but I knew better. The snow was light, barely an inch. No way it erased footprints that quickly. That afternoon, I dragged an old dresser in front of the back door. I wedged a chair under the knob for good measure. I didn't own a gun, but I did have a hunting knife and a hammer, which I kept near me at all times after that. I didn't want to leave early. I told myself I was overreacting, but something felt wrong. It wasn't just the tracks. It was a feeling, like I was being watched. On the fourth night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat by the fire with the lights off, wrapped in a blanket, eyes on the windows. Around 3 a.m., I saw movement. Just a flicker, a shape moving past the front window. I froze, didn't breathe. A few seconds later, I heard a soft thud on the porch. Then that same creaking again. One step, pause, another step. Whoever it was stopped right in front of the door. Then silence. I sat there for what felt like an hour. Never moved, never blinked. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. In the morning, I found the snow on the porch disturbed, like someone had stood there a long time, shuffling their feet. The footprints led down the hill toward the trees. I followed them for about 50 feet before they disappeared into the underbrush. No sign of who made them. That day, I almost left. I packed my bag, threw everything into the car, and started it up. But the engine made a weird grinding noise and then died. I tried again. Nothing. Battery was fine. Fuel gauge said I had a quarter tank, but it wouldn't turn over. I popped the hood. Everything looked normal, but I'm no mechanic. I went back inside, heart sinking. I kept the fire going all day and tried not to panic. That night, I left the lights on. Every single one. I sat with the hammer in my lap, barely blinking. No movement, no sounds. But the next morning, I found something new. On the porch railing, someone had scratched a message into the wood. Just 2 words, "Stay inside." I stared at it for a long time. My hands were shaking. I knew I had to leave. I didn't care if I had to hike out. I packed everything into my bag and started walking down the road toward where I came from. But after a mile or so, I saw something that made me stop. My tire tracks, the ones I'd made driving in, were gone. Covered, but not by snow. Someone had raked the snow smooth, like they didn't want anyone to find the cabin. I turned back. I didn't know what else to do. I was in the middle of nowhere with no phone, no working car, no idea who was out there. I figured it'd be safer to stay inside during the day and only hike out once I had a solid plan. That night was the worst. Around midnight, I heard banging at the back door. Not knocking, banging, like someone slamming their fists into the wood over and over. The chair wedged under the knob held, but the whole door shook. I grabbed the hammer and stood there, heart racing, not breathing. After a minute, the banging stopped. Then I heard footsteps running around the side of the cabin. I sprinted to the front door just in time to see someone disappear into the woods. Tall, wearing dark clothes, moving fast. I didn't sleep. I didn't even sit down. I waited for daylight, then moved the dresser away, grabbed my pack, and started walking again. This time I followed the creek downstream, thinking it might lead to a road. It took me half the day, but eventually I came out near a dirt road with tire tracks. Real ones, fresh. I followed them until I saw a mailbox and an old farmhouse. The man who lived there called the sheriff for me. He was quiet, looked at me strange when I told him where I'd been, said that cabin hadn't been rented out in years. Said the owner, a guy named Harrow, had died 2 winters ago. The sheriff came, asked me a few questions, then drove me back to the cabin to check things out. It was empty, no footprints, no scratches on the railing, nothing disturbed, but my car still wouldn't start. Sheriff had it towed to town. Turns out someone had pulled out a few spark plug wires. Deliberately, they never found who did it. I didn't stay the night in town. I rented a car and drove straight back to Boston. That was 8 years ago. I haven't gone camping since. Haven't stepped foot in Vermont either. I think about it a lot, who was out there, why they didn't break in, what they meant by stay inside. I don't have answers. Just the memory of a cold. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway. That was the plan. A weekend escape from the noise of the city and the stress of my job. I just wanted to find some quiet, maybe do a little reading, enjoy the stillness of the woods. But in hindsight, I should have known better. I should have known it wouldn't be that simple. I'd rented a small cabin, one of those remote places off the beaten path, nestled in the woods. It was 2024, the middle of October, and the air had that crisp, chill bite that I loved. I needed some solitude, and this place seemed perfect. The cabin was about an hour's drive from the nearest town, deep in the forest where only the occasional hiker or camper passed through. The journey itself was peaceful at first. As I turned off the paved road and onto the dirt path leading up to the cabin, the world seemed to close in around me. Tall pine trees stretched up on either side, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The car's tires kicked up dust and gravel as I drove further along the narrow path. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional rustling of the leaves outside. There was a slight warmth in the air, despite the cooler evening, and I rolled down the windows to breathe in the fresh, earthy scent of the forest. The cabin itself came into view shortly after. A small, two-story structure with a steep roof and a porch that overlooked a small, murky pond. It looked almost like something out of a picture book. Rustic, yet charming in its isolation. The walls were weathered wood, and the roof had patches where the shingles were slightly worn down, showing signs of age. A couple of rocking chairs sat on the porch, as if waiting for someone to sit and enjoy the view. It felt like a perfect little piece of peace. I parked the car and grabbed my bag from the back seat, then made my way up to the front door. I had already received the key in the mail, hidden under a small rock by the door. I unlocked it and stepped inside. The interior was even more charming. A small living room with a stone fireplace on one side, an old leather couch, and a couple of armchairs. The floors were hardwood, creaky in places, and the furniture was old, but in a good way. Well-kept, polished wood with a slight patina from years of use. It was cozy in here, and I immediately felt a sense of relief, as though I could finally relax. I set my bag down and wandered through the cabin, inspecting every room. There was a kitchen at the back, fully stocked with everything you'd need to cook a meal, though I had no intention of cooking anything more complicated than a simple dinner. The bedroom was upstairs, small but comfortable, with a big window that overlooked the woods. It was the kind of view that made you want to wake up early just to see the sunrise. By the time I finished settling in, the sun had started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. I was feeling good, happy to be away from everything for a while. I grabbed a book from my bag, lit a candle on the coffee table, and settled in for the evening. The first night went by without incident. There were no strange noises, no interruptions. The wind howled outside, but that was just the typical evening breeze rustling through the trees. I slept soundly, nestled in the warm bed with the quiet of the woods surrounding me. I woke up early, just as the first light of morning filtered through the trees. The next few days passed in a similar way. The mornings were crisp and cool, with fog hanging low over the pond in the valley. I spent the majority of my time reading on the porch or taking short walks along the nearby trails. There was an old path that wound through the woods behind the cabin, and I followed it one morning, enjoying the solitude. The forest was dense, but not dark. Sunlight broke through the trees in scattered beams, and the air smelled sweet with pine and wet earth. On the third day, however, things started to take a turn. It was a simple thing, really, something that might have slipped by unnoticed if I hadn't been paying close attention. But I noticed it. There was a man, an older man, sitting by the edge of the pond one afternoon. At least I thought it was a man. His figure was small, hunched over, and he was sitting just beyond the line of trees that marked the boundary of the property. He wasn't doing anything. He wasn't fishing or swimming or moving at all, just sitting, staring out over the water. I thought it was odd but didn't think much of it at first. There were hikers in the area, after all. The woods weren't completely isolated. But when I looked again after a few minutes, he was still there, unmoving. My first instinct was to call out, to ask if he needed help or if he was lost. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Something about the way he sat there made me feel uneasy, like he wasn't supposed to be there. I went back inside, tried to shake the feeling, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I told myself it was nothing, just some guy who wandered off the trail, maybe out for a walk, maybe a little too deep into the woods. I tried to forget about him, but as the evening fell and the shadows grew long, I found myself keeping an eye out for him. I didn't see him again that night, but as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I kept hearing small noises, twigs snapping, footsteps in the distance. But when I looked outside, the woods were still and empty. The next day, I decided to leave the cabin for a bit. I needed to get away from the woods, clear my head. I packed a small bag with the intention of going into town for a couple of hours. But as I reached the car and started to drive down the dirt path, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The man was standing by the side of the road, just standing there, looking at my car. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. The man didn't move. He just stood there, his face hidden in the shadows of the trees. I couldn't see any details, but I knew it was him. My mind raced. Was he following me? Had he been waiting for me to leave the cabin? I didn't want to stick around to find out. Without thinking, I hit the gas, turning sharply onto the main road and driving as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the town, my hands shaking on the wheel. I spent a few hours in town, walking around and trying to calm myself down. The whole time, I kept thinking about the man, about the way he stood there by the pond and by the road. Why was he watching me? What did he want? When I returned to the cabin that evening, I didn't see him again. For the rest of the trip, I didn't see anyone in the woods. No hikers, no strange figures, nothing. But the unease stayed with me. I double-checked the locks on the doors every night and made sure the windows were secure. And when I finally left, I didn't go back. The cabin was quiet again, and for a long while, that was the last time I thought about it. But every now and then, when I'm out in the woods, I remember the man by the pond. I wonder if he was just a wanderer, or if something darker was going on in those woods. Whatever it was, I've never been able to shake the feeling that there was something off about that place. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on, and I'm never going back. It was October of 2016 when I took a week off work and decided to drive up to a small cabin in the Appalachian Mountains, just outside of Elizabethton, Tennessee. I was 34 at the time, single, living in Knoxville, and working long hours at an IT company that had been slowly draining me. I needed a break. I needed quiet. I needed somewhere without screens or cell service. That's what led me to an old wooden cabin listed online for short-term rentals. It was isolated, right at the edge of the Cherokee National Forest. The photos showed nothing but trees, a small clearing, a thin dirt driveway, and a weathered little place with a tin roof and a narrow porch. It looked perfect, peaceful, a place to breathe. I packed light, a few changes of clothes, basic groceries, a flashlight, a folding knife, a book I'd been meaning to read, and a journal. I also threw in an old hatchet just because it felt like a cabin thing to bring. No TV, no laptop. I left my phone on airplane mode and stuffed it in my bag. I didn't even bring a charger. That was the whole point. Disconnect, recharge. The drive up was long and quiet. Once I left the main road, the signal disappeared, and the gravel roads turned to dirt. I had to check a printed map I'd brought with me, just to be safe. I drove another 30 minutes past any signs of people. No houses, no parked cars, just trees closing in on both sides and the road narrowing enough that I kept the windows cracked just to listen. At one point, I stopped the car, killed the engine, and just sat there, listening to the wind moving through the forest. It was the quietest place I'd ever been. I found the driveway almost by accident. A thin break in the trees. No signs, no mailbox. The dirt was worn from time, but there were still 2 tire tracks that led up a short hill. I followed it carefully and came up on the cabin. It looked just like the photos, small, rustic, with wood that had turned gray and soft from years of weather. The roof was intact, the porch sagging a little but nothing serious. The front door was stiff when I opened it, but it wasn't locked. Inside, it was all one room plus a tiny bathroom in the back. A twin bed, an old wood stove, a small counter with a sink that pulled from a rain barrel outside. No electricity, no running water. Just a kerosene lantern, some firewood, and a rusted-out propane stove that barely worked. It was perfect. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked, cleaned a little, got a fire going in the stove, and sat on the porch for hours, listening to nothing. The kind of silence that hums in your ears because there's nothing else. I made soup from a can, read until sunset, and fell asleep early. That night, I woke up once from a sound outside, a branch snapping, maybe an animal, maybe just the woods settling. I stayed still and listened, but it didn't come again. I drifted back to sleep. The next few days were the kind I had wanted. Quiet mornings, warm coffee on the porch, walks down the narrow game trails that wound through the trees. I found a stream about a mile out and sat there for hours, watching the water move over smooth stones. I didn't see a single person. No voices, no engines, nothing. By the 4th day, I was starting to forget what the world outside even felt like. But then things started to feel off. It was small things at first. I noticed my folding knife wasn't where I'd left it. I'd put it on the shelf near the bed before going to sleep, but the next morning it was on the floor under the edge of the blanket. I assumed I knocked it over in the night, but I hadn't moved in my sleep that much. Then the food. I had brought a cooler with ice packs and kept it near the shaded back wall of the cabin. One morning I found the lid open slightly. A pack of beef jerky was missing, and a small jar of peanut butter had the lid off. I thought maybe an animal got in, maybe a raccoon, but the cooler was heavy, and the lid took force to open. It didn't feel like an animal. On the 5th night, I woke up suddenly. It was around 2:30 a.m. I remember looking at my watch in the dark. The room was cold. The fire in the stove had gone out. But it wasn't that. It was the sound. Not loud, not sharp. Just the soft creaking of the porch boards. One step, then another. Very slow, very deliberate. I laid still in the bed, eyes wide open, straining to hear. 3 more steps, then silence. I reached slowly for my flashlight and flicked it on. The beam cut through the cabin, lighting up dust in the air, and spilled across the door. It was closed. I moved to the window and shined the light out across the porch. Nothing. I opened the door and scanned the clearing. Nothing moved. No wind, no animals. Just dead silence. I barely slept the rest of the night. In the morning, I found footprints. In the dirt just beyond the porch, right at the edge of where the light didn't reach. Not boots, not shoes. Bare feet. Adult-sized. Clear prints in the soft dirt. The toes, the arch, the heel. They went off into the woods and disappeared. My stomach dropped. I stood there, staring at them for a long time. It wasn't a hiker. No one hikes barefoot in this kind of terrain. No one should have even been out here. I hadn't seen a soul in 5 days. I didn't know what to do. I kept telling myself it could have been old. Maybe someone had come through a week before, but they were too clear, too fresh. I walked the perimeter of the clearing, checking the tree line. Nothing. No signs of anyone. That day I stayed close to the cabin. I kept the hatchet with me. Every small sound made my skin crawl. Around noon, I walked the trail down to where I'd seen the stream. I needed to clear my head. As I passed through a patch of thicker woods, I noticed something odd off to the right. About 30 yards from the trail, tucked between 2 trees, was a small pile of rocks. Too neat to be natural, stacked like a marker. I walked over and studied it. There was something under the top stone. A strip of cloth, dark blue. It looked like part of a shirt sleeve. Frayed, dirty, and stiff. I left it there. Back at the cabin, I packed my things. I didn't care that I had 2 days left. I didn't feel safe. Something was wrong. I didn't want to be alone out here anymore. I told myself I'd leave at first light. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the lantern burning low. I kept the hatchet by the bed. I lay under the blanket, listening. Around midnight, the woods came alive with sound. Not animals, movement. Branches snapping. Soft footsteps in the leaves. Then, a sharp knock on the back wall of the cabin. Just one. Then silence. I didn't move. My breathing felt too loud in my own ears. Minutes passed. Maybe an hour. Then another sound, the front doorknob. A slow, soft rattle. Not hard enough to open it. Just testing. It stopped. Then another knock, this time right by the window. I didn't shine my light. I didn't move. I waited, frozen. At some point near dawn, the sound stopped. The birds began to stir. Light started to creep in through the trees. I stood up, every joint stiff and sore, and opened the door slowly. Nothing. But again, in the dirt, footprints. This time circling the cabin. Barefoot. Just one set. Not running. Walking. I left everything behind. I grabbed my bag, keys in hand, and walked fast to the car. As I pulled onto the road and started driving, I felt tears in my eyes. Not from fear exactly, just from relief. The feeling of getting away, of escaping something I still didn't understand. I didn't call the police. What could I say? That someone walked around my cabin barefoot at night? That I heard noises? I didn't even know who to report it to. I just drove home, locked my door, and didn't leave for 3 days. A week later, I looked up the cabin listing online. It was gone, removed completely, no trace of it on the site. I searched the owner's name from the booking email. Nothing. No records, no listings, like it had never existed. I even tried to look up property records for that section of the forest, but it was all public land. Nothing was supposed to be there. I still think about it sometimes. Who was out there? Why were they barefoot? How long had they been watching me? And most of all, what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did? I remember the trip like it was yesterday. The plan was simple. Take a few days off, drive out to a secluded camping spot in the mountains, and disconnect from everything. I wanted solitude. No work, no noise, no phone calls. Just me, the trees, and the open sky. I had picked a location that wasn't on the usual camping maps, a place I had found on an old hiking forum. The directions were vague, but that was part of the appeal. I wanted to be alone, away from crowded campsites and busy trails. I packed my gear carefully, making sure I had everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a few essentials. The drive took longer than I expected. The paved road eventually gave way to a dirt path, and soon I was navigating rocky terrain with no clear signs. My truck bounced along the uneven ground as I followed the GPS coordinates. There were no tire tracks, no signs of recent visitors. That made me feel even better. I wanted isolation, and I had found it. The sun was already dipping below the treetops when I finally reached a small clearing near a river. It was perfect. Flat ground, a water source, and no sign of human activity. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and started a small fire. As darkness settled in, the silence was overwhelming. No cars, no distant hum of civilization, just the occasional rustling of leaves and the chirping of insects. I ate my dinner by the fire, enjoying the crisp mountain air. Everything felt peaceful. I stayed up for a while, staring at the flames, listening to the night. Eventually, I climbed into my tent and zipped it up. The fabric felt thin against the vast wilderness, but I was used to camping alone. I wasn't worried. Sometime in the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The fire outside had died down to embers, and everything was pitch black. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not an animal's quick, scurrying steps. These were slow and deliberate. My mind raced. I had seen no other people on the way here, no vehicles, no campsites. Who else would be out here? I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped. I waited, straining my ears. Nothing. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I had dreamed it. I tried to go back to sleep. Morning came, and I stepped out of my tent, stretching. The forest was peaceful again, the river flowing nearby. But something was off. My gear had been moved. Not much, just small things. My flashlight, which I had placed beside me before sleeping, was now near the fire pit. My backpack was unzipped, though nothing seemed to be missing. I felt uneasy but tried to shake it off. Maybe I had just been careless. Maybe I had knocked things around in my sleep. I told myself not to overthink it. I spent the day exploring. I hiked along the river, took some photos, and enjoyed the quiet. By the time I returned, the sun was already lowering again. I started another fire and cooked a simple meal. As the night deepened, that eerie feeling returned. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the darkness. It was that strange sense of being watched, the same feeling I'd had since waking up. I reassured myself that it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. But I made sure to keep my flashlight within reach as I climbed into my tent. I barely slept. Every little sound jolted me awake. At one point, I thought I heard whispering. Faint, almost like the wind, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. I sat up, gripping my knife, listening. The whispering stopped. Then came the footsteps again. This time, they were closer. I held my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then silence. Whoever or whatever was out there was standing still, just waiting. I wanted to look outside, to shine my light and see, but fear kept me frozen. I couldn't move. I didn't want to know. Minutes passed. Then, finally, the footsteps moved away. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn. When I stepped outside, my stomach dropped. There were footprints, bare human footprints circling my tent. My firewood was scattered. My gear had been moved again. But the worst part was what I found hanging from a tree branch nearby. A small bundle of sticks, tied together with twine, in the shape of a person. I didn't waste time. I packed up as fast as I could, stuffing my tent and supplies into my truck. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I just wanted to leave. As I started the engine, I glanced back one last time. That's when I saw it, deep in the trees just beyond the clearing. A figure, standing still, watching me. I didn't wait to see more. I slammed the truck into gear and drove, bouncing over the rough trail, not stopping until I reached the main road. Only then did I let myself breathe. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. Maybe it was some hermit living off the grid. Maybe it was something worse. I never went back to find out. The trees were tall and thick, their branches interwoven in a heavy canopy that blocked out much of the light from the overcast sky. The road had become little more than a dirt track, winding its way deeper into the forest with each mile. I had driven for hours, the gravel crunching beneath the tires as the world around me grew quieter, more remote. It was the kind of place where you could truly get away from everything. No phone service, no distractions, just the hum of the engine and the rustling of the wind in the trees. I was heading to an old cabin that my uncle had left me when he passed. It wasn't much, just a small, rustic place out in the middle of nowhere, but it was supposed to be my escape from the chaos of the world. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked just as I remembered it. The wood was weathered, the roof sagging in spots, and the front porch creaked as I stepped up to it. The place had a certain charm, though. It felt like it had a history, as if it had stories to tell if you listened closely enough. The door groaned in protest as I pushed it open, and the smell of must and old wood hit me immediately. I set my bag down by the door and took a deep breath. It was quiet, too quiet almost, but I wasn't about to let that bother me. I spent the first few hours inside, unpacking and trying to make the place feel like home. The furniture was old but sturdy. The kitchen, though small, was functional, with an ancient wood stove and a sink that still worked. The living room had a large stone fireplace, and I made a mental note to gather some firewood later. I didn't plan on staying more than a few days, but I wanted to make the most of the time I had here. As evening approached, I decided to go for a walk. The air was cool, with a slight chill that made the trees rustle. The forest around the cabin stretched on for miles, a maze of trees and underbrush that seemed to go on forever. I walked for a while, taking in the beauty of the place. The ground was soft beneath my boots, and the only sounds were the occasional snap of a twig underfoot and the distant calls of birds. It was peaceful, almost unnerving in its tranquility. As I wandered further from the cabin, the woods started to feel more oppressive. The trees seemed to close in around me, their trunks thick and knotted, their branches casting long, twisting shadows. I paused for a moment, listening to the silence. There was no wind now, no sound of animals moving. It was like the whole forest had gone still. My heart began to race for no reason, and I turned back toward the cabin. But as I started walking, I realized something wasn't right. The path I had been following no longer seemed familiar. The trees around me looked different, and the ground underfoot felt strange. My steps grew quicker, more urgent, but the deeper I went, the more lost I became. The cabin was no longer in sight, and the trees seemed to stretch on in every direction, blocking out any hope of finding my way back. I had only been out here for a short while, but already I felt a creeping sense of unease. It was as if the forest was alive, shifting around me. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that I just needed to find the path again. But the more I looked around, the more disoriented I became. The shadows between the trees seemed to grow darker, deeper. I couldn't hear anything anymore. Not the birds, not the wind, not even my own footsteps, just silence. I picked up my pace, breaking into a jog, but it only made things worse. Every tree looked the same, and the underbrush seemed to grab at my legs. My breath came in short gasps, my heart pounding in my chest as panic set in. Then, just when I thought I couldn't go any farther, I saw something ahead. It was faint, just a glimpse at first, but there was something there. A light, small and distant, glowing faintly through the trees. I felt a rush of hope, and I ran toward it, calling out, though I knew no one could hear me. The light flickered, and I pushed myself harder, determined to reach it. When I finally broke through the trees and into a clearing, I stopped dead in my tracks. The light wasn't what I thought it was. It was the cabin, but something was off. The front door was wide open, and the windows were dark, as if no one had been there in years. It looked abandoned, derelict, and yet I knew it hadn't been long since I had left. The chill in the air grew colder, and I felt a sense of dread settle in my stomach. Something wasn't right. I hesitated for a moment before walking toward the door. The wood beneath my feet creaked as I approached, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The air around me felt heavy, thick, like something was watching me. I took a deep breath, stepped inside, and immediately felt the temperature drop. The cabin was darker than before, and the smell of must seemed stronger, more pungent. The door slammed shut behind me, and I jumped, my heart leaping in my chest. I spun around, but there was no one there. I turned back to the cabin, trying to shake the feeling that something was off. It was as if the place was alive, breathing, waiting for something. The walls seemed to close in around me as I walked through the narrow hallway, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. I made my way into the living room, and my eyes immediately fell on the fireplace. It was cold, but there was something about it that drew me in. I approached it cautiously, and that's when I saw it. In the hearth, partially hidden under a pile of old, burnt logs, was a small, weathered object. I crouched down, pulling the logs away. It was a small metal box, rusted and old. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I opened the box slowly, afraid of what I might find inside. But when I lifted the lid, there was nothing but dust. Nothing but emptiness. I sighed, relieved, but still uneasy. It didn't make sense. Why was this box hidden here? What had it been used for? I closed it again, setting it back in the hearth, and stood up. That's when I noticed the strange marks on the floor. At first, I thought it was just the wood aging, but the marks were too precise, too deliberate. They formed a pattern, something I couldn't quite make out. I ran my fingers over the floor, tracing the lines. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But then, I heard something. A creaking noise. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer. It sounded like someone was walking around outside. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer or something, but the noise grew more distinct. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I moved to the window, peering through the curtains. The forest outside was still, quiet once more, but I could feel the presence of something out there, watching. I stepped back from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. Whatever it was, I didn't want to find out. The idea of being trapped in this cabin with something or someone out there was too much to bear. I ran to the back door, pulling it open, only to find that the yard was just as empty as the front. I stepped outside, my shoes crunching on the gravel as I looked around. The air was colder now, and the shadows seemed longer, darker. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my bag and headed toward my truck, determined to leave this place behind. The drive back was long and nerve-wracking, the forest pressing in on me as I raced toward the road. But when I finally reached the main highway, I felt a strange sense of relief. I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me, but there was nothing. Just the dark, empty road stretching out behind me. I never went back to the cabin after that day. It's still out there, standing alone in the woods, its door creaking in the wind. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I do know one thing. I won't be going back to find out. It was late in the fall when I decided to head up to the cabin. The air had turned crisp, with the leaves just beginning to lose their color, but I was excited for the solitude. I'd been working too much, and I knew the peaceful silence of the woods would be exactly what I needed. The cabin had been in the family for generations, tucked away in a remote part of the forest, a place to unwind and disconnect. I packed my things: clothes, food, some books, and a couple of beers. Nothing too fancy. I was just going to be there for a few days. I didn't want anything that would distract me from the quiet. I'd been up there a few times before, so I was familiar with the area. The drive up was uneventful, the road winding through the forest, turning from paved to dirt as I got closer. The last mile was always the roughest, and this time was no different. The weather was holding up, but I could see dark clouds gathering on the horizon. When I finally arrived, I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. The cabin was just as I remembered it, small but sturdy. It had a wooden exterior that had weathered over time, the edges worn smooth from years of exposure to the elements. The roof had patches of moss, and the porch creaked as I stepped onto it. The smell of pine and damp earth filled the air. Inside, everything was just as I'd left it. Basic furniture, a wood stove in the corner, a couple of old chairs, and a small kitchen area with a stove and a sink. I liked it that way. There was no need for anything more. I unpacked, stowed my gear away, and started a fire in the stove to take the chill off. As the fire crackled, I grabbed a beer, sat in one of the old chairs, and stared out the window. The woods were quiet. Too quiet, I thought. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. It was strange, but not alarming. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every small sound. The crackle of the fire, the distant rustle of the trees, the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I spent the next few hours reading and relaxing. The storm I had seen earlier in the day was starting to roll in, the wind picking up and the rain starting to patter against the roof. The weather had a way of making you feel small out there. The forest felt alive, but in a way that was more unsettling than comforting. As the night deepened, I noticed the storm getting louder, the wind whipping through the trees, bending them in odd shapes. The fire was warm, but it didn't seem to reach the corners of the room. It was dark outside, and the only light came from the flickering flames. Around midnight, I decided to turn in. The bed was comfortable enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I lay there in the dark, listening to the storm outside. The howling wind seemed to press against the cabin's walls, and the occasional thud of something heavy hitting the roof sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't the storm. It wasn't the noise. It was just a feeling. Something was wrong. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something in the woods. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I stared into the darkness of the room. I tried to relax, but sleep wouldn't come. The wind outside was growing stronger, and the sound of the rain against the windows was deafening. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It was faint at first, just a rustle in the leaves. But then it got louder: footsteps, crunching through the wet leaves and twigs. My heart skipped a beat. I held my breath and listened harder. It was definitely footsteps, not an animal, but the unmistakable sound of boots on the forest floor. My mind raced. Who could be out there at this time of night? There was no one for miles. I got out of bed and quietly made my way to the window. I didn't want to make a sound, afraid that whatever was out there might hear me. I peered through the rain-smeared glass, but there was nothing, just the dark outline of trees in the distance, swaying in the wind. My stomach tightened. I couldn't explain it, but something about the silence after the noise made my pulse quicken. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for another sign, but there was nothing. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just the storm, maybe a branch falling or an animal moving through the woods. I returned to bed and pulled the covers up tight, but sleep didn't come easy. My mind kept racing. Every creak of the cabin, every snap of a twig outside, made me jump. I tried to focus on the sound of the rain, the steady beat of it on the roof, but even that couldn't calm my nerves. The next morning, I woke up to a stillness that felt wrong. The storm had passed, but there was no sign of the usual life in the woods. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. The air was thick and damp, and the sky above was a heavy gray. I could feel the weight of it all pressing down on me. I had planned to go for a walk, but something told me to stay put. I spent the morning inside, pacing, cleaning, trying to keep myself busy. The day dragged on, each minute feeling heavier than the last. It was the quiet that got to me. The longer I stayed, the more I felt like I was being watched. Every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of something moving outside, but when I looked, there was nothing there. Around noon, I decided to go outside, even though I wasn't sure if I wanted to. I grabbed my jacket and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cold and damp, and the ground was wet from the rain. I walked around the cabin, my boots crunching on the wet leaves. The woods were eerily quiet, and for the first time, I felt like I was completely alone. That's when I noticed the tracks. They were fresh, the mud still soft where something or someone had walked. They were large, deep prints like heavy boots. They circled the cabin, going all the way around it. My heart raced as I followed them with my eyes. Whoever had been out here had walked slowly, methodically, almost like they were making sure I saw them. The tracks led off into the trees, but I didn't follow them. I didn't want to. I turned and hurried back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I couldn't focus on anything. I kept checking the windows, looking out into the woods, but there was no sign of anyone. The tracks outside were still there, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there watching. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I stayed up, pacing the cabin, checking the windows, the door, listening for any sound that might give me a clue as to who was out there. But there was nothing. Just the wind, the rain, the occasional creak of the cabin settling. By morning, I had enough. I wasn't sure what I was afraid of, but I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed up my things, quickly and quietly, and loaded my car. As I was about to drive away, I glanced at the woods one last time. The trees stood still, silent, as if they were waiting for something. And then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its gaze on me. I didn't wait to see any more. I slammed the car into gear and sped down the dirt road, not looking back until I was miles away. I don't know what I saw that weekend, but I know I won't be going back to that cabin. The woods are quiet again now, but I still can't shake the feeling that something is out there. Something that knows I was there. Something that will always be watching. I may never understand what happened, but I do know one thing. Sometimes the scariest things aren't the ones you see. It's the ones you can't explain. And that's what makes them the most terrifying. The drive to the cabin was longer than I expected. The roads were narrow, twisting through dense forest, and the map I had printed out was surprisingly outdated. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of a faded sign pointing to some trail or campsite. My car was a little out of place, not built for these roads, but it managed, rattling along over uneven terrain. I could feel my excitement growing with each mile I got closer. I was ready to be alone, away from the noise of everyday life. Finally, I turned down a narrow dirt road. It was so overgrown that I nearly missed it. My tires crunched over the gravel as I pulled up to the cabin, nestled between towering trees. It looked exactly like the pictures in the listing, old, wooden, with a weathered porch. There was something about it, though, that felt off. The door creaked in the wind, and the porch floorboards seemed to groan with age. It was like the cabin had been abandoned for a long time, but I knew from the listing it wasn't. The surrounding area was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves. I grabbed my backpack from the car and walked up to the porch, unlocking the door with the key I'd been given. The inside of the cabin was just as I expected, rustic, simple. The furniture was old but sturdy, the kind you might find at an estate sale or a thrift shop. A fireplace sat at one end of the room, with a few logs stacked neatly beside it. The windows looked out over the lake, which shimmered faintly in the distance. I smiled, glad to be in such a peaceful place. I took a few moments to unpack, settling into the space. The kitchen was small, but it had everything I needed. I started a small fire in the fireplace to take off the chill of the evening air. Outside, the The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the trees. The sky was a soft, dusky pink, and the air was crisp, a stark contrast to the heat of the day. As night fell, I sat in front of the fire, listening to the quiet crackling of the logs. I didn't bring much with me, just a couple of books and a journal. I wanted to clear my head, not get distracted. The only thing I really heard was the occasional rustling from the trees and the croak of distant frogs. But then, there was another sound, a slight creaking, as if the porch was shifting under the weight of something. I shrugged it off. The cabin was old, after all. Old houses make noises. I had no reason to think otherwise. The first night passed without incident, and the next day was just as peaceful. I spent some time by the lake, skipping stones and enjoying the isolation. The sound of the water lapping gently against the shore was soothing, and I let my mind wander. I knew this was the kind of place that could make me feel at home again. It was perfect, too perfect, maybe. On the second night, as I sat in front of the fire, I started to hear that creaking again. This time it was louder, and it seemed to come from somewhere inside the cabin. I froze. I couldn't pinpoint where exactly it was coming from, but it felt like it was moving. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. I walked through the cabin, checking each room. The sound stopped as soon as I stood still. I checked the door, made sure everything was locked, and sat back down by the fire, trying to ignore the growing feeling in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't until later that night, around midnight, that things started to feel wrong. I woke up suddenly, a cold sweat on my skin. The fire in the hearth had died down to glowing embers, casting strange, flickering shadows across the room. I heard the sound again, the creaking, but this time it was followed by a faint, dragging noise. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly stood, my legs shaky. I crept through the cabin, moving cautiously from room to room, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone or anything that could explain the noises. I even checked the back door to make sure no animals had gotten inside, but there was nothing. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling again. Maybe it was the wind outside, but deep down I felt uneasy. The next day, I decided to leave the cabin for a bit, go for a long walk around the lake, clear my head. I needed to stop overthinking everything. But even as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The woods felt too still, too quiet. My footsteps seemed too loud, echoing in the emptiness. Every rustling leaf made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone behind me. But of course, there was no one. I reached the far side of the lake and sat on a rock, staring at the water, trying to steady my nerves. That evening, I decided to light the fire earlier than usual. The dark had a way of making everything feel more menacing, and I wasn't sure I could handle another night of feeling that creeping sense of dread. I kept the lights on, even though I usually preferred to keep things dim. I wasn't sure what I expected, but I figured it might help. The hours passed, and I didn't hear anything. No creaking, no dragging. I thought maybe I had imagined it all. Maybe I had been too tired, too alone. Maybe the isolation had played tricks on my mind. But as I lay in bed, drifting off to sleep, the creaking came again. It was faint, but it was there. This time, I didn't get up. I stayed in bed, my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. My heartbeat thudded in my chest as I listened, trying to make sense of it. Was it just the house settling? The floorboards? The wind? But then I heard it again, and this time it was different. There was a tapping sound, like someone was knocking on the walls. It wasn't a random noise. It was deliberate. I knew it wasn't just my imagination. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and crept toward the front door, peering through the peephole. Nothing. I stepped back, trying to think rationally. Maybe there was some explanation. Maybe a tree branch had caught on the roof or the wind had knocked something loose. I couldn't let myself get too worked up. But the fear was rising, and I knew I had to do something. I gathered my things and left the cabin. I didn't care if I was supposed to stay until morning. I needed to leave, needed to feel like I was safe again. The drive out of the woods was long and treacherous, but I didn't care. I didn't stop until I was back on the main road, and even then, I didn't feel safe. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something following me, but there was nothing. The road was empty, dark, and quiet. Eventually, I made it back to a small town. I found a hotel, checked in, and collapsed into the bed. I never went back to that cabin, and I never planned to. It's been weeks now, and I still don't know what happened out there. I can't explain the noises, the feeling of being watched, or the way everything seemed too quiet, too still. All I know is that I couldn't stay. I didn't feel safe, not even for a second. As for the cabin, I heard later that someone else rented it out not long after I left. I'm not sure if they ever experienced what I did, but I hope they didn't. I hope they never heard those creaks and taps, and I hope they felt safe, even in that old, secluded place. But I'll never know, because I'll never go back to that cabin. I don't care how much time passes. It was the kind of place where something felt wrong, and once you feel it, you can never shake it. I had been looking forward to the weekend in the cabin for weeks. It wasn't the first time I'd gone up to the small, secluded cabin in the woods, but this time something felt different. It was late October, the air was crisp, and the woods were still alive with color, reds, oranges, yellows. The cabin was an old, rustic structure, built decades ago, surrounded by tall trees and a thick forest that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. I loved the isolation, the sense of peace it offered, far from the noise and chaos of everyday life. When I pulled up to the cabin, the driveway was covered in a thin layer of fallen leaves. The small, dirt path up to the door was just wide enough for my car to fit through. The cabin itself looked as I remembered it, weathered with a stone chimney that barely puffed out a wisp of smoke. The roof had moss creeping up the sides, and the windows, though clean, were small, giving it a sort of old-timey charm. It had been passed down from my uncle, and I was grateful to have it as a quiet getaway. I unloaded my bags into the cabin, each movement feeling heavier than usual. Something about being here alone started to make me uneasy, but I shrugged it off. It wasn't the first time I'd been alone in the woods. I'd come here countless times before without a problem. I lit the small wood stove to warm up the place. The fire crackled softly in the corner of the living room, and the warmth quickly spread through the small, dimly lit cabin. As night began to fall, I noticed the silence. It was the kind of silence that swallowed everything. A quiet so deep that you could hear your own heartbeat. I didn't mind it at first. I welcomed it, in fact. But as the darkness crept deeper into the woods, I started to feel a little restless. The trees outside creaked and groaned as the wind picked up, but it wasn't an ordinary wind. It was the kind that seemed to whisper, as if the trees were speaking to each other, maybe even to me. I chuckled at the thought, trying to shake the strange feeling that seemed to settle into my bones. The night was calm, but the isolation kept tugging at me. The cabin had no neighbors for miles. The nearest house was over an hour's drive away. If something happened, I would be alone. I tried not to think about it too much. I was just being paranoid, right? I had the whole place to myself, no one to disturb me, no distractions. That's exactly why I came here, to get away from everything, even my own thoughts. I decided to go for a walk before bed. The moon was full, and it cast a pale, ghostly light over the forest. The path was familiar to me, though the darkness made it seem unfamiliar, as if the trees were trying to hide the way. I wasn't afraid at first, but as I walked deeper into the woods, I felt an odd sensation that I wasn't alone. It wasn't a feeling of someone following me, nothing so obvious, but more like a sense of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something, or someone, just out of sight. I kept walking, hoping it was just my imagination, but the longer I walked, the more intense the feeling grew. The woods, which I had always thought of as peaceful, suddenly felt vast and oppressive, like they were closing in around me. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath, trying to calm myself. The air was colder now, and the wind had picked up again, rattling the branches above me. I couldn't help but feel like the trees were watching me, their twisted forms casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. I turned around to head back to the cabin, but something caught my eye. Just off the path, near the base of a large oak tree, I saw a strange shape. It was hard to make out in the darkness, but it looked like a pile of leaves, except it was too still. I stepped closer, my curiosity outweighing my unease. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a pile of leaves at all, but a large bundle of something. I bent down, my heart pounding in my chest, and brushed away the top layer of leaves. Underneath, there was a jacket. It was an old, faded jacket, the kind you'd wear if you were out in the woods for a long time. I picked it up carefully, my hands trembling. As I held the jacket, a faint, musty odor filled the air. It smelled like it had been out here for a long time. I looked around, trying to make sense of it. Who would leave something like this out in the woods, miles from the nearest road? I stood up, the jacket still clutched in my hands. That's when I heard it. A faint crack, like a twig snapping, came from the direction of the cabin. My stomach dropped. I wasn't alone. I turned quickly and began to walk back toward the cabin, my heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, just out of sight. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, there was nothing there, but the sensation grew stronger. When I finally reached the cabin, I bolted the door behind me, my mind racing. What had I just seen? What had I heard? I dropped the jacket on the floor, my hands still shaking. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going back out there. Not tonight. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to calm my mind. The crackling of the fire was the only sound in the cabin, and the silence outside felt even heavier than before. I tried to focus on the warmth, on the peacefulness, but the strange feeling wouldn't leave. Something was off and I couldn't shake it. I finally decided to go to bed. I locked all the windows and doors and pulled the blankets tightly around me. I lay there, wide awake, listening to the wind howling outside. The fire had died down to embers, casting flickering shadows across the room. I closed my eyes, but every sound seemed amplified in the silence. I thought I heard something tapping against the window, but when I opened my eyes, nothing was there. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but it didn't feel like that. I finally drifted off to sleep, but it was a restless sleep, filled with half-formed dreams and waking moments. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud bang. Came from the roof. I sat up in bed, heart hammering in my chest. It was the kind of noise you couldn't ignore, like something heavy had just fallen onto the roof. I listened intently, but the house was silent again. I grabbed a flashlight from the bedside table and crept out of bed, my legs feeling weak beneath me. I went to the window and peered outside, scanning the darkness. There was nothing there. The wind was still, the trees still, as though nothing had happened. I slowly lowered the flashlight, my mind racing. What was going on? I'd spent countless nights in this cabin before, and nothing like this had ever happened. I felt like I was losing my grip on what was real. The next morning, I woke to bright sunlight streaming through the window. The cabin looked peaceful in the daylight, almost like nothing had happened the night before. But the feeling of unease hadn't left. I didn't want to stay in the cabin any longer, but I didn't want to leave either. I decided to pack up and head back to town. As I was gathering my things, I noticed the jacket again. It was still on the floor where I had left it the night before. I picked it up, this time feeling the weight of it more clearly. There was something about it that made me uncomfortable, something about it that didn't fit. I threw the jacket into the car and locked up the cabin. As I pulled away, I took one last look at the place that had been my refuge for so long. It seemed quiet, still, and almost welcoming in the morning light. But the events of the night before would stay with me. I couldn't explain them, and I wasn't sure I wanted to try. As I drove down the dirt road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, something from deep in the woods. The trees were tall and thick, their branches interwoven in a heavy canopy that blocked out much of the light from the overcast sky. The road had become little more than a dirt track, winding its way deeper into the forest with each mile. I had driven for hours, the gravel crunching beneath the tires as the world around me grew quieter, more remote. It was the kind of place where you could truly get away from everything. No phone service, no distractions, just the hum of the engine and the rustling of the wind in the trees. I was heading to an old cabin that my uncle had left me when he passed. It wasn't much, just a small, rustic place out in the middle of nowhere, but it was supposed to be my escape from the chaos of the world. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked just as I remembered it. The wood was weathered, the roof sagging in spots, and the front porch creaked as I stepped up to it. The place had a certain charm, though. It felt like it had a history, as if it had stories to tell if you listened closely enough. The door groaned in protest as I pushed it open, and the smell of must and old wood hit me immediately. I set my bag down by the door and took a deep breath. It was quiet, too quiet almost, but I wasn't about to let that bother me. I spent the first few hours inside, unpacking and trying to make the place feel like home. The furniture was old but sturdy. The kitchen, though small, was functional, with an ancient wood stove and a sink that still worked. The living room had a large stone fireplace, and I made a mental note to gather some firewood later. I didn't plan on staying more than a few days, but I wanted to make the most of the time I had here. As evening approached, I decided to go for a walk. The air was cool, with a slight chill that made the trees rustle. The forest around the cabin stretched on for miles, a maze of trees and underbrush that seemed to go on forever. I walked for a while, taking in the beauty of the place. The ground was soft beneath my boots, and the only sounds were the occasional snap of a twig underfoot and the distant calls of birds. It was peaceful, almost unnerving in its tranquility. As I wandered further from the cabin, the woods started to feel more oppressive. The trees seemed to close in around me, their trunks thick and knotted, their branches casting long, twisting shadows. I paused for a moment, listening to the silence. There was no wind now, no sound of animals moving. It was like the whole forest had gone still. My heart began to race for no reason, and I turned back toward the cabin. But as I started walking, I realized something wasn't right. The path I had been following no longer seemed familiar. The trees around me looked different, and the ground underfoot felt strange. My steps grew quicker, more urgent, but the deeper I went, the more lost I became. The cabin was no longer in sight, and the trees seemed to stretch on in every direction, blocking out any hope of finding my way back. I had only been out here for a short while, but already I felt a creeping sense of unease. It was as if the forest was alive, shifting around me. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that I just needed to find the path again. But the more I looked around, the more disoriented I became. The shadows between the trees seemed to grow darker, deeper. I couldn't hear anything anymore. Not the birds, not the wind, not even my own footsteps, just silence. I picked up my pace, breaking into a jog, but it only made things worse. Every tree looked the same, and the underbrush seemed to grab at my legs. My breath came in short gasps, my heart pounding in my chest as panic set in. Then, just when I thought I couldn't go any farther, I saw something ahead. It was faint, just a glimpse at first, but there was something there. A light, small and distant, glowing faintly through the trees. I felt a rush of hope, and I ran toward it, calling out, though I knew no one could hear me. The light flickered, and I pushed myself harder, determined to reach it. When I finally broke through the trees and into a clearing, I stopped dead in my tracks. The light wasn't what I thought it was. It was the cabin, but something was off. The front door was wide open, and the windows were dark, as if no one had been there in years. It looked abandoned, derelict, and yet I knew it hadn't been long since I had left. The chill in the air grew colder, and I felt a sense of dread settle in my stomach. Something wasn't right. I hesitated for a moment before walking toward the door. The wood beneath my feet creaked as I approached, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The air around me felt heavy, thick, like something was watching me. I took a deep breath, stepped inside, and immediately felt the temperature drop. The cabin was darker than before, and the smell of must seemed stronger, more pungent. The door slammed shut behind me, and I jumped, my heart leaping in my chest. I spun around, but there was no one there. I turned back to the cabin, trying to shake the feeling that something was off. It was as if the place was alive, breathing, waiting for something. The walls seemed to close in around me as I walked through the narrow hallway, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. I made my way into the living room, and my eyes immediately fell on the fireplace. It was cold, but there was something about it that drew me in. I approached it cautiously, and that's when I saw it. In the hearth, partially hidden under a pile of old, burnt logs, was a small, weathered object. I crouched down, pulling the logs away. It was a small metal box, rusted and old. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I opened the box slowly, afraid of what I might find inside. But when I lifted the lid, there was nothing but dust. Nothing but emptiness. I sighed, relieved, but still uneasy. It didn't make sense. Why was this box hidden here? What had it been used for? I closed it again, setting it back in the hearth, and stood up. That's when I noticed the strange marks on the floor. At first, I thought it was just the wood aging, but the marks were too precise, too deliberate. They formed a pattern, something I couldn't quite make out. I ran my fingers over the floor, tracing the lines. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But then, I heard something, a creaking noise. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer. It sounded like someone was walking around outside. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer or something, but the noise grew more distinct. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I moved to the window, peering through the curtains. The forest outside was still, quiet once more, but I could feel the presence of something out there, watching. I stepped back from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. Whatever it was, I didn't want to find out. The idea of being trapped in this cabin with something or someone out there was too much to bear. I ran to the back door, pulling it open, only to find that the yard was just as empty as the front. I stepped outside, my shoes crunching on the gravel as I looked around. The air was colder now, and the shadows seemed longer, darker. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my bag and headed toward my truck, determined to leave this place behind. The drive back was long and nerve-wracking, the forest pressing in on me as I raced toward the road. But when I finally reached the main highway, I felt a strange sense of relief. I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me, but there was nothing. Just the dark, empty road stretching out behind me. I never went back to the cabin after that day. It's still out there, standing alone in the woods, its door creaking in the wind. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I do know one thing. I won't be going back to find out. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, the sky overcast and clouds hanging low, almost as if they were pressing down on the trees that surrounded the isolated structure. I had been planning this trip for months, looking forward to the peace and quiet, the escape from the busy world. No distractions, no phone signals, just me and nature. The cabin was nestled deep in a forest, far away from any neighbors or roads, and that's exactly what I had wanted. It was a place where I could disconnect, think, and enjoy some solitude. As I pulled up to the small, wooden cabin, the engine of my truck rumbled to a stop, and I took a deep breath. The air smelled fresh, earthy, with a hint of pine. It was a familiar scent, one that reminded me of camping trips from my childhood, of times when the world felt simpler and less chaotic. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat and stepped out of the truck, the gravel driveway crunching beneath my boots. The cabin was old, but it looked sturdy enough. The wood was weathered, but not in a way that seemed dangerous. There was a large porch at the front with a couple of chairs set up facing the forest, as if someone had once sat there, taking in the view. I didn't know who owned the cabin before me, but it didn't really matter. I was here to get away, not to think about the past. I walked up to the door, pulled out the keys from the small envelope the rental company had given me, and unlocked it. The door creaked open, and the smell of old wood and dust hit me. It wasn't unpleasant, just a little musty, like a place that hadn't been lived in for a while. The inside was exactly as I had expected. A living room with a stone fireplace, a couple of couches, and a small dining area off to the side. To the left, there was a kitchen with an old but functional stove and fridge. A set of stairs led up to a loft where the bedroom was. The place had a rustic charm to it, though I could tell it hadn't been updated in years. It was the kind of cabin you'd expect to find in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place where no one cared about modern amenities or the latest trends. It was perfect. I spent the first couple of hours unpacking my things and settling in. The only sound was the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards beneath my feet. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, not even a radio. Just silence. It was strange at first, but I quickly got used to it. I made a fire in the fireplace and sat down on one of the couches, staring into the flames. The warmth of the fire was comforting, and as the night fell, the darkness outside seemed to envelope the cabin, making it feel even more secluded. The windows were covered by thick curtains, but even so, I could tell it was getting late. The wind outside had picked up, rustling the trees, and the temperature was dropping. I decided to make some dinner, something simple, a can of soup I'd brought with me. The kitchen was small, but it was enough to cook what I needed. As I opened the can and poured the soup into a pot, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease creeping in. It wasn't anything specific, just a feeling. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was the eerie quiet of the place. The fire crackled in the background, and I told myself I was just overthinking it. I stirred the soup and watched the steam rise, trying to focus on the simple task. Dinner was uneventful, and afterward, I cleaned up and sat back down by the fire. I had brought a book with me, but I wasn't in the mood to read. The night seemed to stretch on forever, and I found myself staring at the dancing flames, lost in thought. It was only when I heard the first strange sound that I realized how much time had passed. It was a soft thud, almost like a branch hitting the side of the cabin. I didn't think much of it at first, chalking it up to the wind or a loose piece of wood. But then I heard it again, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound. Came from above, from the roof. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything, just the trees swaying in the wind. I convinced myself that it was probably just an animal, maybe a raccoon or something else making its way across the roof. The sound stopped for a while, and I settled back into my chair, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The wind outside had picked up again, howling through the trees, and the fire crackled loudly, as if trying to fill the silence that had taken over the cabin. As the night wore on, I started hearing more noises, scraping, thudding, and even what sounded like footsteps across the roof. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it or if the wind was playing tricks on me, but the noises seemed to be getting closer, more deliberate. My pulse quickened. I had convinced myself earlier that it was just an animal, but now I wasn't so sure. There was something off about the sounds, something about the way they seemed to move, as if someone or something was up there walking around. I tried to brush it off, but every time I heard a noise, I found myself glancing nervously at the door, at the windows. The wind had died down, and now the silence was almost deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the cabin settling. But then, out of nowhere, I heard a loud bang, so loud it shook the walls. I jumped up, my heart racing. The sound came from the back of the cabin, from the direction of the woods. It was so sudden and forceful that it sent a chill through my body. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Could have been a tree branch falling, or maybe an animal crashing into something. But the sound was too deliberate, too intentional. I grabbed the flashlight I had brought with me, feeling a sense of dread wash over me. The thought of going outside in the dark, alone, made my stomach turn. But I couldn't stay inside forever, imagining things. I had to know what it was. I stepped out onto the porch, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. The night was still, the trees barely moving in the faint breeze. I slowly made my way around the cabin, scanning the area with the flashlight, trying to see anything out of the ordinary. But there was nothing. No signs of any animals, no broken branches, no footprints. The ground was hard, and the dirt had no marks on it. I checked the back of the cabin, then the sides, and finally the roof. The flashlight beam bounced off the shingles, but nothing seemed out of place. No one was up there. The roof was intact, and there was no sign of any movement. I felt a sense of relief, but it was short-lived. As I was about to turn back toward the porch, I heard another noise. This time, it was a faint scraping sound coming from the far corner of the cabin, from where the trees grew thicker. I froze. I had been so focused on the roof and the immediate surroundings that I hadn't even thought to check the area near the trees. The sound came again, sharper this time, like something or someone was dragging itself along the ground. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to see what was out there. With my flashlight shaking in my hand, I approached the trees. The air was colder now, and the silence seemed to stretch on forever. Every step I took felt heavier, like the ground itself was pulling me down. My heart was thudding in my chest, my breath coming out in short gasps. The scraping sound grew louder, closer. Then I saw it, a figure, half hidden in the shadows of the trees, crouched down low to the ground. It was a person, or at least it looked like one. But something about the way it moved, the way it was crouched, didn't sit right with me. It was as if it was trying to stay hidden, trying to blend in with the darkness. I couldn't make out any details, just the vague shape of a person, barely visible in the dim light. I wanted to run, to get back to the safety of the cabin, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on the figure. It seemed to be watching me, and I realized then that it wasn't making any noise anymore. It was as if it was waiting for me to make the first move. Without thinking, I turned and ran back to the cabin. I bolted the door behind me and locked every window. My heart was racing, my mind spinning with thoughts of what I had just seen. I didn't know who or what that was, but I wasn't taking any chances. The rest of the night was long and filled with tension. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, sent my nerves on edge. I didn't sleep a wink, too afraid to close my eyes. In the morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't look back. I never found out who or what had been out there, but I didn't need to. The fear that had gripped me that night was enough to make me leave without any questions. I never went back to that cabin, and I've never told anyone the full story. It's a memory that still haunts me, but I've come to terms with it. Sometimes, when I'm alone in a quiet place, I wonder what it was that I saw that night. But I don't think I'll ever really know, and maybe that's for the best. I had always wanted to get away from the noise, from the constant distractions of the city. The idea of a weekend at a cabin in the woods had always seemed like the perfect escape. So, when a last-minute opportunity came up to rent a secluded cabin for a few days, I jumped at the chance. The cabin was located in a remote part of the forest, far from any towns or cities. The pictures of it online showed a rustic log cabin surrounded by tall trees, nestled by a small stream. It seemed like the kind of place you go to get some peace and quiet, maybe do a bit of reading, enjoy the fresh air. It was exactly what I needed, or at least I thought so at the time. I arrived just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The cabin was even more charming in person than in the pictures. It was small but sturdy, with a stone fireplace on the front and a wooden porch that creaked under my feet as I stepped onto it. The air smelled fresh, earthy, with the slight hint of pine. There was no one else around. No neighbors, no sounds of traffic, just the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. I had the whole place to myself. The only thing I could hear was the sound of the stream running nearby and the chirping of distant birds. I felt a wave of calm wash over me, the kind of relief that only comes from complete silence. Inside, the cabin was simple, with wooden floors and exposed beams overhead. The furniture was old but comfortable. A leather couch, a few armchairs, and a wooden dining table. The kitchen was fully equipped, although I couldn't imagine needing much more than a kettle and a small stove while I was here. The bedroom was small but cozy, with a thick quilt on the bed and a view out the window of the stream and trees beyond. I unpacked my bag and started a fire in the fireplace. The warmth filled the room, and I sank into one of the chairs, letting the crackling sounds of the flames relax me. The plan for the weekend was simple: to enjoy the solitude, maybe take a walk in the woods, and just disconnect from everything. I made a cup of tea, wrapped myself in a blanket, and sat there, listening to the sounds of the fire and the night outside. As the evening wore on, I began to feel that odd, unsettling sensation that comes with being alone in a place so quiet. It wasn't fear exactly, just an awareness that I was completely isolated. There were no other people here. No one would hear me if something went wrong, but I shrugged it off. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. I was used to being alone. After all, I'd lived on my own for years. I didn't need company to feel safe, or so I convinced myself. The first night passed without incident. I woke up a few times in the dark, listening to the sound of branches scratching against the window, but it didn't feel threatening. Just the wind, I thought. I told myself that over and over as I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. I'd been told there were hiking trails nearby, and I figured it would be a good way to pass the time. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, the cool morning air hitting my face. The ground was damp from dew, and the forest smelled fresh, like wet earth and pine. The trees here were old and massive, their trunks thick and knotted with age. The path was narrow, winding through the woods with the occasional clearing where sunlight broke through the canopy. I walked for a few hours, enjoying the peace and the solitude. The only sounds were my footsteps on the dirt path, the wind rustling the leaves, and the distant calls of birds. It felt like the kind of place you could lose yourself in, and I let myself do just that. I didn't worry about time, didn't think about anything except for the present moment. At one point, I reached a small clearing near the edge of the forest. The sun had warmed the ground, and the trees had thinned, leaving a small patch of open space. There was a fallen log near the center, and I sat down on it to take a break. I pulled out my water bottle and drank deeply, looking around at the surrounding trees. It was beautiful here, untouched and wild. But then something caught my eye. Across the clearing, just at the edge of the trees, I noticed a small structure. It was hard to make out from where I sat, partially hidden by the trees, but it looked like a shack or an old shed. I hadn't seen anything like it on the map or heard anyone mention it. It was strange because it didn't look like part of the cabin or any of the trails, just an abandoned structure, sitting quietly in the woods. Curiosity got the better of me. I stood up, dusted myself off, and started walking toward it. As I got closer, I noticed that the shack seemed older than I first thought. The wood was weathered and worn, the door hanging slightly ajar. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The area around it was overgrown, with vines creeping up the sides of the building and small bushes pushing through the cracks in the ground. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should even be this close. What was this place doing out here so far from the main cabin and trails? But then again, it wasn't like there was anyone around to stop me from looking. I was alone, and I'd already come this far. I reached the door, and with a gentle push, it creaked open. The inside was dark, musty, and smelled faintly of mildew. There was nothing inside except for old crates and piles of debris. A few rusty tools were scattered about, and a thin layer of dust coated everything. It didn't look like anyone had been here in ages. I wasn't sure what I had expected, but it wasn't this. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the shack was off. I didn't know why, but it felt wrong to be there. Maybe it was just the isolation, the eerie quiet of the place, or the fact that it had been abandoned for so long. But I felt a shiver run down my spine. I backed out slowly, trying not to make too much noise. I didn't want to disturb anything, but I also didn't want to stay there any longer than I had to. I turned back to the trail, feeling relieved to be away from the shack. The rest of the walk was uneventful, and by the time I made it back to the cabin, the sun was low in the sky again. I felt a strange sense of unease, but I brushed it off. It was probably nothing. That night, I stayed inside. I cooked a simple dinner, read a book by the fire, and went to bed early. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept thinking about the shack in the woods, about the feeling it gave me. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I had uncovered something I wasn't supposed to. something that had been forgotten for a reason. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of something scraping against the cabin's door. It was a faint noise, almost like a branch brushing against the wood. I sat up, trying to shake off the lingering unease from the night before. The wind must have picked up, I thought. The trees were swaying, and the branches were probably moving in the wind. I tried to ignore it, but then I heard it again. The scrape, a bit louder this time. It was coming from the direction of the door. I got up and walked over to the door cautiously, my heart racing for reasons I couldn't quite understand. When I opened it, I saw nothing. The porch was empty. No branches, no signs of movement. But I could feel that strange sense of tension in the air, the same feeling I'd had in the woods. I shook my head. I was just imagining things. I had been out in the woods too long. I needed to relax. But as the day went on, the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, like a shadow I couldn't escape. I couldn't focus on anything, couldn't shake the nagging thought that something was wrong. So, I decided to leave the cabin, get some fresh air, and try to clear my head. I packed a small bag with water and snacks, and I set out toward the woods again. But this time, I didn't go down the same path as before. I walked a different way, toward a part of the forest that I hadn't explored yet. As I walked, I tried to push the thoughts of the shack and the strange noises from my mind. The forest was still beautiful, still peaceful, but the unease was creeping back, like a weight on my chest. The further I walked, the more I started to feel like I wasn't alone. I turned around and retraced my steps. I didn't know why, but I had the strong urge to go back to the cabin. I needed to get out of the woods, away from whatever it was that was bothering me. It wasn't fear exactly, it was more like an instinct, a gut feeling that something wasn't right. When I reached the cabin, I locked the door behind me and sat in front of the fire. I couldn't explain it, but I was starting to feel like I had made a mistake coming here. The quiet, the isolation, it was starting to feel oppressive. But the next morning, when I finally packed up to leave and got in my car to drive back to the city, I felt a sense of relief. It was over. The woods, the shack, the strange noises, they were all behind me now. I don't know if I'll ever go back. But when I left, I made sure to drive in the opposite direction of the cabin, the forest fading into the distance. I couldn't help but feel that I had stumbled onto something I wasn't meant to, something hidden in the woods, waiting to be discovered. And that was the last time I ever went back. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. The cabin was remote, nestled deep in the woods far from any town, and I had rented it for a weekend of solitude. Just me, the cabin, and nature. I needed to get away from the noise of everyday life, to clear my head. The plan was simple. Unwind, get some reading done, maybe do a little hiking, and most importantly, disconnect. I left my phone behind, deciding I didn't need any distractions. It was a 2-hour drive to get there, mostly on narrow, winding roads. The last stretch was gravel, barely wide enough for my car to pass through. As I bumped along, I noticed how isolated the area felt. There were no other houses for miles, and I could barely see any signs of human life. The trees crowded around, casting long shadows in the late afternoon sun. When I finally reached the cabin, it was exactly what I'd hoped for. Simple, rustic, and surrounded by tall trees. The wood had a weathered look to it, the kind that made it feel like it had been standing for decades. A small porch with a rocking chair overlooked a small stream. The sound of rushing water was calming, almost soothing. I unloaded my things, just a few bags of clothes, a couple of books, a flashlight, and some food. The inside of the cabin was cozy, if a bit dusty. There was a wood-burning stove, a small kitchen with just the basics, and a loft where the bed was tucked away. The windows were big, letting in plenty of natural light, and I noticed that there weren't any curtains or blinds. I didn't mind, though. It made the place feel even more open and connected to the outdoors. After I settled in, I decided to take a walk around the cabin to explore the area. The woods around the cabin were dense, with trees so tall they seemed to stretch forever. The air smelled earthy, damp from the recent rain. The ground was soft beneath my feet, and I could hear the crunch of leaves as I moved deeper into the forest. It was quiet, too quiet. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of branches in the wind and the distant call of a bird. As I walked, I noticed a small trail leading off to the left, hidden under a thick layer of fallen leaves. It seemed like it could lead somewhere interesting, so I followed it, curiosity pulling me deeper into the woods. The trail was narrow, barely wide enough for me to walk comfortably, and the trees seemed to press in from both sides. The further I went, the more I felt like I was venturing into an unknown part of the forest. The sun was beginning to set when I decided to turn back, but something felt off. The path I'd been following didn't seem to lead back to the cabin. I tried retracing my steps, but the trees looked different now, more dense, and the underbrush seemed to have changed. I couldn't remember exactly which direction I'd come from. I started to panic. My heart rate quickened, and my breathing grew shallow. The forest was no longer the calming retreat it had seemed when I first arrived. It was a maze, and I was lost in it. The shadows were stretching longer, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried calling out, but my voice was swallowed by the trees. The air had turned cooler, and the wind had picked up, making the branches creak and groan. I couldn't help but feel like something, or someone, was out there, hidden in the darkness just beyond my sight. But there was no one. The woods were completely still. As I walked in what I hoped was the right direction, I stumbled upon something strange. A small clearing appeared ahead of me, and in the center was an old, rotting wooden crate, half buried under a pile of leaves. I felt an unsettling chill run down my spine as I approached it. There was nothing remarkable about the crate, just an old, beat-up box that had been left there to rot. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it didn't belong there. The box felt wrong, like it was part of some forgotten history that didn't want to be uncovered. I stood there for a moment, staring at the crate. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't resist the urge to inspect it. Cautiously, I knelt down and pried open the lid. Inside, there were a few items, old, worn pieces of fabric, some broken tools, and a collection of small, rusted nails. But the most bizarre thing was the small, hand-carved figurine nestled at the bottom of the crate. It was a rough carving of an animal, perhaps a deer or a dog, though it looked odd, like it had been made in a hurry. The edges were sharp, and it was covered in some sort of dark stain, though I couldn't tell if it was dirt or something else. I didn't know why, but I felt a sense of dread as I held the figurine in my hands. It felt cold, heavier than it should have been, and I almost dropped it when I noticed something etched into the back. A symbol I didn't recognize. It wasn't a language I knew, but it looked ancient, something from another time. I quickly shoved the figurine back into the crate and slammed the lid shut. That was when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible rustling in the trees, followed by the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. My pulse shot up, and I whipped around, my eyes scanning the darkness. There was nothing there, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone or something was out there. I ran. I don't know how long I sprinted through the woods, but every step I took seemed to carry me further away from the cabin. The trees closed in around me, the trail disappearing under the thickening darkness. My mind raced, but all I could focus on was the sound of footsteps behind me, growing louder with every passing moment. It wasn't until I stumbled over a root and fell that I realized I had no idea where I was. The forest was an endless maze, the trees now towering over me like silent sentinels. I couldn't even hear the distant murmur of the stream anymore. The wind had stopped, and the forest was completely silent, save for the pounding of my heart in my ears. I sat up, breathless, and tried to calm myself. It had to be an animal, right? Maybe a bear or a deer or something else that was just moving through the woods. But no, the sound hadn't been that of an animal. It had been too deliberate, too human. I stood up, panic rising in my chest, and began walking again, slower this time, trying to make sense of my surroundings. That was when I saw the faint glow of light through the trees. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I realized it was coming from the direction of the cabin. I wasn't too far off after all. I moved toward the light, but the closer I got, the more I felt like something wasn't right. The air was colder now, and the trees were almost completely black in the shadows. When I finally reached the cabin, I felt a strange relief, but also a nagging sense of unease. The porch light was on, but it flickered oddly, as though it was struggling to stay lit. I hadn't left it on when I left earlier. I stepped inside quickly, locking the door behind me. The silence inside the cabin was almost worse than the silence outside. I sat down, trying to collect my thoughts. I had no explanation for what had happened in the woods or what I'd heard. I didn't know if I should call someone, but I didn't want to leave. It felt safer here, even though the sense of dread had only grown stronger. For the rest of the evening, I stayed inside, too afraid to step out again. I kept the lights on and tried to focus on reading, but every little noise sent my heart racing. The wind had picked up outside, howling through the trees, and the cabin creaked and groaned in response. But I didn't go outside again. The next morning, I packed up and left. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in those woods. But more than that, I felt like I had been warned. Whatever had been out there, whatever I had disturbed with that figurine, wasn't something I should have ever gotten involved with. As I drove away, the forest seemed to stretch out in every direction, endless and dark. But the further I got from the cabin, the more I felt like I could breathe again. The weight on my chest lifted, and the world started to feel normal once more. It wasn't until later, as I was unpacking back at home, that I found the figurine tucked into the bottom of my bag. I didn't remember putting it there. I didn't want to keep it, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away either. So I buried it, deep in the backyard under a pile of rocks. And though I never went back to that cabin or the woods, I still find myself glancing over my shoulder every now and then, wondering if something is watching me, waiting. I arrived at the cabin on a cold Friday afternoon. It was a small, weathered place, tucked away in the middle of a dense forest. I had rented it for the weekend to get away from everything: work, the noise, the stress of life. The air smelled crisp, the kind of fresh scent you only get when you're far from any city. I had seen pictures online, but now that I was standing in front of it, I couldn't help but notice how isolated it felt. The trees seemed to swallow the place whole, their long branches stretching out like arms. The cabin itself looked old, the kind of structure that had seen its fair share of harsh winters. The wood was faded and chipped, and the chimney had a thin layer of soot on it, suggesting that it had been used recently. It didn't look run down, but it certainly had a certain character to it. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The place was small but cozy. The wooden floors creaked under my feet, and the scent of pine and old wood filled the air. A small living room greeted me first, with a worn-out couch, a couple of armchairs, and a stone fireplace. There was a fire going in the hearth, casting a soft glow and the comforting scent of burning logs throughout the room. A rug covered the center of the floor, and there were bookshelves on the walls, though most of the books looked like they hadn't been touched in years. The kitchen was small but fully equipped. There was a small table near the window, and beyond that, a staircase led to the second floor. Upstairs, I could see two doors. One was probably a bedroom, the other a bathroom. I set my bags down and made myself at home. I felt a slight unease, but I chalked it up to being in a new place, surrounded by unfamiliar sights and sounds. The wind outside had picked up, and I could hear the trees groaning in the distance. It wasn't a loud sound, but it was constant, like a deep, resonant hum. I tried not to focus on it. I had come here to relax, after all. The first day went by slowly. I explored the woods a little, walking around the cabin, letting the fresh air fill my lungs. There was a small stream nearby, the water flowing over rocks with a soothing gurgle. I spent hours by the water, just sitting and listening to the sounds of nature. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. At times, I felt like I was the only person alive in the world, like I had stepped into some kind of forgotten place. But that was what I had come for, right? To get away, to disconnect. It was what I needed. As night began to fall, I returned to the cabin, feeling the temperature drop. The wind had picked up again, and the trees seemed to move more violently now, their branches scratching against the windows like fingers searching for something inside. I tried to ignore it, I had a fire going in the hearth, and the warmth of the cabin felt good against the cold night air outside. I made dinner, pasta and some grilled chicken, and then sat down to eat, staring out the window at the darkening forest. There were no streetlights out here, no signs of life beyond the occasional flicker of headlights far off in the distance. It felt like I was in the middle of nowhere, and for some reason, that thought started to gnaw at me. The isolation, the silence, the complete lack of anything else. That night, I went to bed early. The bed was comfortable enough, though the room felt colder than it had in the living area. I pulled the thick blanket over me, but it didn't help much. The chill in the air seemed to settle deep into my bones. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly, gasping for air. I couldn't tell what had woken me, but I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone. I lay still for a moment, listening, trying to convince myself that I was just imagining things. But then I heard it. Footsteps, faint and muffled, moving just outside my bedroom window. My heart began to race, and I pulled the covers tighter around me, my mind racing. Could it be someone from the nearby town? Maybe another hiker who had lost their way? Or had I just imagined the sound? It didn't make sense. I knew I should have just stayed calm, but the thought of someone being out there, close enough to hear but not close enough to see, sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe right. The footsteps stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, trying to convince myself that I had only been dreaming. But the more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that I hadn't. The sound came again, closer this time. There was no mistaking it. Someone was out there. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? No service out here, no reception. I cursed myself for not thinking about that sooner. I was alone in a cabin in the middle of nowhere with no way to get help if something went wrong. My mind raced through all the possibilities, each one worse than the last. Part of me knew I should go downstairs, lock the doors, and make sure everything was secure. But the thought of moving, of getting out from under the covers, terrified me. The footsteps continued, moving slowly, deliberately. The person, if that's even what it was circling the cabin, getting closer to the door. My mind was spinning now, thoughts scattered and incoherent. I wanted to yell, to scream, to do something, but I stayed frozen, praying whatever it was would go away. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest. Every tiny sound, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind in the trees outside made me jump. But there was nothing. I waited for what felt like hours, just staring at the door, waiting for it to burst open. But nothing happened. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight from the bedside table and slowly crept out of bed. The house felt colder now, like the warmth had been sucked out of it. I tiptoed to the window, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand as I peered through the blinds. I saw nothing but trees, the wind moving the branches in a slow, eerie dance. No one was out there. Nothing. I didn't know what to think. I had heard the footsteps. I knew I had, but now there was no sign of anyone. I slowly turned around and made my way back to the bed, though I couldn't seem to relax. I kept my flashlight on, pointing it around the room like it might reveal something I had missed. I stayed awake the rest of the night, just listening to the wind and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. By morning, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. The sun had come up, and the first light of day seemed to bring some relief. I got out of bed and went downstairs, checking the locks on all the doors and windows. There was no sign of anyone having been around. No tracks in the snow outside. No broken branches. Nothing. It was as if the whole thing had never happened. But I knew it had. I had heard those footsteps. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there, just watching. The rest of the day passed without incident, but I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. I kept imagining things moving in the trees, shadows that weren't quite shadows. I had planned to stay for another night, but I couldn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin wasn't as safe as I had thought. The isolation, the strange sound in the night, it all felt wrong. By sunset, I packed my things and left. The drive back felt like a relief, like I was finally getting out of whatever hold the cabin had on me. I didn't know what had happened that night, but I didn't need to. The important thing was that I was leaving. I had made it through, and that was all that mattered. I never went back to that cabin. And every time I think about it, I still remember the sound of those footsteps, the way they circled the cabin, moving closer and closer until they just stopped. I don't know who or what they were, and I'm fine with not knowing. I'm just glad I made it out in one piece. The cabin was meant to be an escape. I needed a break from the constant noise of the city, the pressure of work, and the distractions that surrounded me every single day. When I found the listing for the cabin in the woods, it seemed perfect. A small, remote place far from anyone and anything. Just me, a few books, and the trees. I drove up the winding road, the kind that gets smaller the further you go, with nothing but tall, dense trees lining each side. The smell of pine filled the air, crisp and clean. Felt like a step back in time where things were simpler. The cabin itself was tucked between two hills, far enough away from the road that I couldn't hear cars or any other signs of civilization. The only thing that greeted me was the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No birds chirped, no distant cars hummed. It was like the world had just stopped. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe I just wasn't used to the silence, having spent so many years surrounded by the noise of the city. The cabin was small, but it had everything I needed. A cozy living room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with a stove and a small fridge, and a loft bedroom that overlooked the living area. The wooden beams on the ceiling, the rough-hewn floorboards. It was everything I imagined when I thought about a cabin in the woods. I unpacked my things, made myself a cup of tea, and sat in front of the fire, feeling the weight of the world fall away. For the first few days, everything was perfect. I woke up with the sun, took long walks through the forest, and spent hours reading. I'd never felt so relaxed. The simplicity of it all was refreshing. But then, on the fourth night, things started to change. It was late, maybe 11 or so, and I was sitting by the fire again, reading. The wind had picked up, howling outside like a freight train. It rattled the windows and shook the walls of the cabin. I didn't mind it at first. It was actually kind of soothing, like the cabin was alive and breathing with the storm outside. But then, I started to hear something else. At first, it was just a faint creak, like wood settling. But then it came again, louder this time, followed by a soft thump. My eyes darted to the window, but all I could see were the dark outlines of trees swaying in the wind. There was no one out there. No one could be out there. The nearest neighbor was miles away. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the wind or an animal outside. But then the thumping came again, and this time it was closer. It sounded like someone was walking around the outside of the cabin, their footsteps heavy on the wooden porch. I stood up, my heart starting to race, and walked to the window. I peered through the blinds, but there was nothing. No one. Just the dark trees and the howling wind. I felt foolish, but the fear was creeping in. I didn't know what to make of it. I checked the door, making sure it was locked. It was. I checked the windows. They were secure too. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there. I spent the rest of the night by the fire trying to keep myself busy. I forced myself to read, to stay calm. But I couldn't. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind, made my heart skip a beat. I barely slept that night, and when the sun finally came up, I was exhausted. The next day, I decided to go into town. Maybe I needed to get away from the cabin for a little while. I didn't know if I could stay another night there without losing my mind. I packed my things and drove down the winding road, the whole time feeling like someone was watching me. It was irrational, but the feeling wouldn't go away. When I got to town, I went to a small cafe to get some coffee. The town was tiny, almost like a ghost town, but there were a few people scattered around, having breakfast or chatting. I sat at a table by the window, sipping my coffee, trying to calm my nerves. But then something caught my eye. A man in a dark coat was standing outside the cafe, looking directly at me. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, staring. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel his gaze, like he knew exactly who I was. My stomach twisted into knots. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. After a few minutes, the man turned and walked away, disappearing down the street. I spent the rest of the day in town, trying to relax, but I couldn't stop thinking about the man. Why had he been staring at me? And why did it feel like he was waiting for me to leave the cafe? By the time I returned to the cabin that evening, I was already on edge. I checked the locks again, went around the entire cabin to make sure everything was secure. But this time, it didn't feel right. It was as if the whole place had changed. The air felt heavier, more oppressive. The silence was deafening. I tried to distract myself again, lighting a fire and reading, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart race. Every gust of wind made me jump. I couldn't explain it, but something was wrong. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. The thumping. This time, it was louder, closer, like someone was standing right outside my window, listening to me breathe. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I just lay there, my body frozen in fear, listening to the soft footsteps on the porch. The hours dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. Couldn't sleep, couldn't relax. I kept my eyes on the window, praying that whatever it was would leave. But it didn't. The footsteps continued, circling the cabin, getting closer and closer. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the noise stopped. The silence returned. I waited for what felt like forever before I finally dared to get up. I crept to the window and looked out, but there was nothing. No one. Just the dark trees swaying in the wind. I didn't know what to think anymore. Maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. I decided that I needed to leave. It wasn't worth it. I come here to relax, but instead, I felt more on edge than I ever had in the city. I packed up my things early the next morning and left. I didn't even stop to lock the door behind me. I just got in my car and drove, leaving the cabin, the forest, and everything else behind. As I drove back down the winding road, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. For a split second, I thought I saw something in the trees, standing still, watching me drive away. But when I looked again, there was nothing. Just the empty road stretching out in front of me. The whole drive back, I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like someone was following me. But nothing ever happened. When I finally got home, I was exhausted, but relieved. The city felt like a safe haven compared to that cabin in the woods. The strange thing is, after a few days, I started to feel better. The tension I'd been carrying in my shoulders, the constant feeling of being watched, it all started to fade. I thought maybe I had just overreacted, let my imagination get the better of me. But then one day I got an envelope in the mail. It was a simple, unmarked envelope. No return address, no name, just a piece of paper inside. It read, "Asterisk, you weren't alone out there. Asterisk." I threw it away, not wanting to think about it. But part of me wondered, what if I hadn't been alone? What if the man I'd seen in town was somehow connected to the strange events at the cabin? What if he was watching me even now? But in the end, it didn't matter. I was home, and I was safe. I didn't want to go back to that cabin. I didn't need to know the truth. Whatever had happened there, it was over. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could finally breathe again. It was supposed to be a simple getaway, a break from the hustle and noise of the city, a weekend alone in a remote cabin, far from anything resembling civilization. I had found the place online, a cozy cabin tucked away in a dense forest, a place where I could unplug and clear my mind. The listing had mentioned it was secluded, peaceful, and perfect for someone who just needed time to themselves. It sounded like the ideal escape, so I booked it, not thinking much more about it. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air was cool, crisp even for that time of year, and there was an odd silence in the woods that felt heavy, almost like the trees were holding their breath. As I drove up the narrow dirt road, I saw the cabin in the distance, nestled among a thick cluster of trees. It looked just like the pictures, small, rustic, a little worn down but charming in its own way. The kind of place you would expect to find in a horror movie, though I didn't think about that at the time. I parked the car by the cabin and grabbed my bag, walking up to the front door. It was made of dark wood, weathered by years of exposure to the elements. There was no one around, no other cars or signs of life anywhere. The cabin seemed completely isolated. I found the key hidden under a small rock by the door and let myself in. Inside, the cabin was exactly what I had imagined. The wooden floors creaked underfoot as I stepped inside, and the smell of old pine filled the air. The main room was a small living area with a worn-out couch, a stone fireplace, and a few mismatched chairs. There was a kitchen off to the side with an old stove and refrigerator, and a tiny dining table in the corner. The cabin had a certain charm, but it was clear it hadn't been updated in years. The walls were lined with old photographs and hunting trophies. There was a small wooden staircase that led to a loft, which I assumed was the bedroom. I unpacked my things and took a look around the cabin. There was no cell service, and the only source of light was a few old lamps scattered around. It was getting darker outside, and the thought of being alone in such a secluded place started to feel a bit unsettling. Still, I told myself I was being ridiculous. People go on trips like this all the time. It was just a cabin, after all. The first night was uneventful. I made myself dinner and sat in front of the fire, reading a book and enjoying the peace and quiet. The wind outside began to pick up, rustling the leaves in the trees, but it didn't bother me. I was used to the sounds of nature. I went to bed early, wrapped in a thick blanket, feeling cozy and safe. But around midnight, I woke up. The cabin was unusually cold, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I sat up in bed, listening, trying to pinpoint the source of the discomfort. There was a faint sound, like a soft scraping noise, coming from below, in the living room. My heart started to race as I held my breath, straining to hear. It wasn't the wind or an animal or anything I could easily explain. The sound seemed deliberate, methodical. I waited for a few minutes, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it was a branch scraping against the window or an animal trying to get in. But I didn't think it was either of those. Something felt wrong. After what felt like an eternity, I got up and quietly crept to the top of the stairs. I could barely make out the shadows below, but the scraping sound was unmistakable now. It was coming from the far corner of the room, near the fireplace. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to move down the stairs, inch by inch. I reached the bottom, trying not to make a sound, and peeked around the corner. Nothing. The room was empty. I stood there for a few moments, trying to calm my racing heart. The fire had burned low, and the room was dimly lit by the soft glow of the embers. It was eerily quiet, too quiet. I scanned the room, looking for anything out of place. The floor was covered in old wooden planks, the kind that creaked when you stepped on them. There was a bookshelf against one wall, covered in dust, and a few old chairs scattered around. Nothing seemed amiss. The scraping sound had stopped. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe the wind had shifted, or there was something outside making a noise. I went back to bed, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sounds out of place. Every time I heard a creak or a thud, my heart would race, and I would sit up, wide-eyed, hoping I was just imagining things. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that I had been imagining it all. There had been no scraping, no strange sounds. It was just my mind playing tricks, nothing more. I spent the day exploring the area around the cabin, walking through the woods and enjoying the solitude. The forest was dense, the trees tall and ancient, their branches swaying gently in the wind. The only sounds were the calls of distant birds and the rustling of leaves underfoot. It was beautiful, serene, and I began to feel a little more at ease. But that evening, As the sun began to set and the shadows grew longer, the strange feeling returned. Couldn't shake it. Something was wrong, and I couldn't figure out what it was. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees, and the cabin seemed colder, even though the fire was burning brightly in the hearth. I went through the usual routine, making dinner, reading by the fire, but every time I heard a noise, every time the floor creaked underfoot, I would freeze, my heart pounding in my chest. Around 10 p.m., I decided to go to bed early again. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, and I hoped that a good night's sleep would help me shake the unease that had settled over me. But as I lay there in bed, just on the edge of sleep, I heard it again. The scraping. This time it was louder, closer. It wasn't just coming from the corner of the room. It was coming from the hallway, from the stairs leading up to the loft. My blood ran cold. I could hear the sound of something dragging across the floor. Slow, deliberate, as if someone or something was moving carefully through the cabin. I sat up, holding my breath, trying to listen for any other sounds. I could hear my own heart beating in my ears, the thumping echoing through the silence of the cabin. The scraping continued, closer now, and I knew without a doubt that it wasn't the wind, or an animal, or any other explanation I had tried to convince myself of earlier. I had to find out what it was. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and slowly made my way to the top of the stairs, my hand shaking as I gripped the rail. I could see the faint outline of the hallway below, the shadows stretching out in odd angles. The scraping sound was unmistakable now, and it was coming from the far end of the hallway, near the door that led outside. My mind raced. I was alone here. There was no one else. But the sound was real. The scraping continued, methodical and persistent. With a deep breath, I stepped down into the hallway. My footsteps were muffled by the thick carpet on the floor, but every creak of the wood felt like a thunderclap in the silence. I moved toward the door, the scraping getting louder and louder with every step. As I reached for the doorknob, I turned it slowly, bracing myself for whatever was on the other side. The door opened with a soft creak, and there, in the dim light of the flashlight, I saw it. A large, heavy wooden box, sitting at the base of the door. It wasn't there when I had arrived. I knelt down and cautiously opened it. Inside, there were old tools, saws, hammers, nails, the kind of things you would find in a workshop. But what caught my attention was a large, rusted chain coiled at the bottom. The scraping sound had been the chain dragging across the floor. I stood up, my head spinning. Who would leave something like this in a cabin? Why hadn't I noticed it earlier? And why did it feel so deliberate? I grabbed my things and left the cabin. I didn't care about finishing my weekend or about whatever the purpose of that box was. Something wasn't right, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out. The drive back to the city was long and silent, but when I reached the safety of my apartment, I finally felt some relief. It had been a strange, unsettling experience, but one I would soon forget, I told myself. The scraping, the box, the cold silence. They were all just strange coincidences, nothing more. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had been watching me that night. That feeling would stay with me for a long time.